1904. Fall asleep to Hilarious History. The Waffle Cone and the War of the Rising Sun by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Section 1. The St. Louis Smorgasbord. Chapter 1. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition. By the time 1904 rolled around, the human race had collectively decided that the 19th century had been a bit too leisurely, a long Victorian nap filled with overstuffed chairs and poets who took entirely too long to die. The 20th century, by contrast, arrived with the subtle grace of a steam whistle blown directly into one's ear. It was a change of pace that required significantly more calories, and, as it turned out, a great deal less oxygen. People were moving faster, talking louder, and wearing collars so stiffly starched they could serve as structural support for a bridge. In the midst of this burgeoning frenzy, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, decided it was the perfect venue to host the most gargantuan, sprawling, and physically exhausting party in the history of the species, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. The pretext for this gathering was to celebrate the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase, a land deal from 1803, where Thomas Jefferson bought 2 million square kilometers of dirt from a very stressed Napoleon Bonaparte for about $15 million. At 3 cents an acre, it was the greatest real estate flip in human history. To celebrate this century of ownership, the United States did what any self-respecting nation would do. It built a temporary city of 1,200 acres and invited the rest of the world to come look at it while eating things they had never seen before. The architecture of ambition and plaster. St. Louis in the summer is not so much a climate as it is a biological experiment. The humidity doesn't just sit on you, it introduces itself, moves in, and starts demanding half your lunch. Yet it was in this boiling cauldron of Missouri air that the organizers decided to build the Ivory City. They constructed massive, gleaming palaces, the Palace of Electricity, the Palace of Fine Arts, the Palace of Agriculture, designed to look like the eternal marble ruins of Rome and Greece. However, because the American spirit is fundamentally impatient, these buildings were not made of marble. They were made of staff, a mixture of plaster of Paris and hemp fiber. It was a magnificent architectural sham. To the naked eye, it looked like a monument to the ages. In reality, it was a city of glorified crackers. Had there been a particularly enthusiastic rainstorm, the entire Roman Empire would have melted into a gray puddle of hemp and disappointment. Observation. There is nothing more quintessentially American than building a 12-story neoclassical temple out of plaster and then planning to tear it down with a sledgehammer 6 months later. It is a monument to the fact that we will build anything if there's a chance to sell a souvenir at the end of it. The Great Souvenir Hunt. The Exposition was a spectacle so large it made the rest of the planet look like a neglected backyard. There were over 1,500 buildings. If a man wanted to see every exhibit for just 1 minute, he would have had to stay in the park for several years, by which time he would have missed the next 3 World's Fairs and his own funeral. But the real heart of the fair wasn't the Palace of Liberal Arts or the high-minded speeches about the progress of man. The real heart was the Pike, the mile-long stretch of entertainment, noise, and commercial wizardry. This was where the average citizen went to be swindled. and they went with a smile on their face and a nickel in their hand. The 1904 fair perfected the art of the souvenir. In 1803, we bought the land. In 1904, we bought the commemorative spoon. People wandered the grounds in a state of sensory overload, purchasing everything from postcards to miniature busts of Teddy Roosevelt carved out of butter. We had discovered that while manifest destiny was a grand geopolitical concept, manifest consumerism was much more profitable. The world had come to St. Louis to see the future, and the future, it turned out, was a small, useless trinket that you would lose on the train ride home. The magic of the bottled ghost. One cannot discuss the 1904 fair without mentioning the electricity. While the rest of the country was still squinting by the light of kerosene lamps and hoping the barn didn't catch fire, the fair was a riot of incandescent bulbs. When the sun went down over the Grand Basin and the switches were thrown, over 100,000 lights flickered to life. Grown men wept, women fainted, though, to be fair, women in 1904 fainted if a door slammed too hard, thanks to the aforementioned corsets. People called it the Palace of Light. They thought they were seeing a divine revelation. In reality, they were seeing the death of the night. The fair taught the American public that the 20th century was going to be bright, it was going to be loud, and it was going to be powered by coal-fired boilers hidden behind a very thin layer of plaster. It was the first time humanity realized that if you have enough copper wire and a large enough steam engine, you can pretend that the sun never goes down. A change of pace. The fair was a monument to the strenuous life advocated by President Roosevelt. It was a place where you were expected to walk 20 miles a day, look at 1,000 different things, and maintain a state of patriotic fervor while your feet swelled to the size of prize-winning hams. It reflected a world that had decided that more was always better than better. More buildings, more lights, more people, more noise. We had decided that the 20th century wouldn't be won by the most contemplative nation, but by the one that could move the most dirt and sell the most ice cream. As the visitors wandered through the Street of All Nations, a bizarre collection of human exhibits that ranged from the informative to the profoundly offensive, they were participating in a global realignment. We were no longer a collection of isolated villages. We were a sprawling, chaotic, interconnected mess of people who all shared a common desire to see something new, even if that new thing was just a man from a far-off land trying to figure out why Americans were so obsessed with commemorative spoons. The St. Louis Smorgasbord was the opening act. We had built the stage, lit the lights, and invited the world. We had perfected the art of the temporary city. Now all we needed was something to eat while we watched the world change. And as it happened, just a few yards away, an ice cream vendor was about to run out of bowls, and a Syrian immigrant was about to roll up a waffle, and history, the delicious dripping kind, was about to be made. The final inventory of the fair. Size, 1,272 acres, approximately the size of 3,000 football fields, for those who measure history in sports. Cost, $15 million, exactly what we paid for the land originally, proving that inflation is a cruel mistress. Main attraction, the Ferris wheel from the 1893 Chicago Fair. Because why build a new wheel when the old one still makes people dizzy. The lesson: if you build a city out of hemp and plaster, make sure it doesn't rain. If you build a century out of ambition and steam, make sure you have enough coal. The 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition was a magnificent, ridiculous, humid success. It told us that the 20th century was going to be a grand spectacle, a bit of a sham, and entirely too crowded. But above all, it promised that if we just kept moving, we might eventually find where we were going, or, at the very least, we'd find a better snack along the way. Chapter 2. The Architecture of the Waffle Cone. The Delicious Packaging of Destiny. If the Palace of Electricity was the mind of the 1904 World's Fair and the Grand Basin was its soul, then the pike was undoubtedly its stomach. And the stomach of 1904 was a restless, demanding organ. It was no longer content to sit at a table for 3 hours while a man in a waistcoat explained the provenance of the soup. The 20th century stomach wanted to see the infant incubators exhibit, the Battle of Santiago reenactment, and the Tyrolean Alps, all while moving at a brisk 4 miles per hour. This created a logistical crisis. How does one consume a semi-liquid dairy product while maintaining the momentum required to see 1,200 acres of plaster grandeur? The answer was not found in a laboratory or a patent office. It was found in the desperate, sweltering intersection of an ice cream shortage and a surplus of Syrian pastries. It was the birth of the waffle cone, an invention that proved once and for all that necessity isn't just the mother of invention. She's also the primary shareholder in the snack food industry. The hygiene of the penny lick. To understand the genius of the cone, one must first understand the horror of what came before it. In the late 19th century, if you wanted ice cream on the street, you were served a penny lick. This was a small, thick glass goblet filled with a dab of ice cream. You licked the glass clean, handed it back to the vendor, and he, in theory, wiped it with a rag that had already seen more action than a battlefield surgeon's apron. The penny lick was essentially a biological exchange program. You got a hint of vanilla, the next person in line got your streptococcus. By 1904, the burgeoning science of germs had begun to cast a suspicious eye on this practice. The public was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, sharing a glass cup with 5,000 strangers in a Missouri heat wave was not the pinnacle of civilization. At the St. Louis Fair, vendors were using small glass or paper bowls. But the heat was so oppressive and the crowd so vast that the supply of clean dishes couldn't keep up with the demand. People were eating ice cream as if their lives depended on it, which, given the internal body temperatures being reached in those wool suits, they arguably did. The collision of necessity and zalabia. Enter Arnold Fornacieux, an ice cream vendor whose stock of clean bowls had dwindled to zero. He stood there, surrounded by melting cream and angry parched fairgoers, facing the ultimate capitalist nightmare, a line of customers with money and nothing to put the product in. Next to him was Ernest Hamway, a Syrian immigrant selling zalabia, a thin, wafer-like Persian pastry that was crisp, sweet, and currently being ignored because it didn't involve ice. Hamway looked at Fornacieux's crisis, looked at his own pile of waffles, and performed a feat of lateral thinking that would make Archimedes look like a slow learner. He took a hot zalabia off the griddle, rolled it into a cornucopia, and let it cool for a second, until it became a rigid, edible sleeve. He handed it to Fornacho, who plopped a scoop of ice cream on top. In that moment, the world shifted on its axis. The ice cream didn't leak. The container didn't need to be washed. And most importantly, when you were finished with the contents, you could destroy the evidence by eating the bowl. It was the first zero-waste initiative in American history, though we didn't call it that then. We just called it getting your money's worth. The metaphor for modern politics. The waffle cone is more than just a snack. It is a perfect metaphor for the political landscape of the 20th and 21st century. Twain's law of consumption. The success of any endeavor is directly proportional to how much the public likes the packaging, regardless of the quality of what's inside. Think about it. The cone is the ultimate spin. It makes the product appear larger than it is. It provides a structural illusion of stability, while the interior is rapidly melting into a sticky, unmanageable mess. Most importantly, it keeps the consumer's eyes on the sweetness, while their hands are busy preventing the whole thing from collapsing. In Washington, we call this a legislative package. In St. Louis, they just called it a World's Fair cornucopia. Both involve a lot of cold air, a fragile structure, and the distinct possibility that you'll end up with a ruined shirt. The Battle of the Inventors. Of course, because this was America in 1904, the invention of the cone immediately triggered a civil war of patents and egos. No sooner had the first Zalabia been rolled than 5 other men stepped forward, claiming they had thought of it first. There was Italo Marchione, an Italian immigrant in New York who had actually patented a mold for making pastry cups in 1903. But Marchione's cups had tiny handles and looked like teacups made of biscuit. They lacked the rugged, portable, strenuous life energy of the rolled St. Louis cone. The St. Louis version was an accident born of a heat wave. Marchione's version was a calculated engineering project. Naturally, the American public preferred the accident. We have always had a romantic fondness for the idea that our greatest achievements are the result of us being unprepared and slightly overheated. The birth of the walking consumer. The waffle cone did something far more profound than just save Arnold Fornacho's business. It liberated the human being. Before the cone, eating was a stationary act. You sat. You used a utensil. You looked at the person across from you. The cone turned the human into a self-contained mobile refueling unit. It allowed the fairgoer to consume calories while simultaneously gawking at the giant floral clock. It was the birth of the walking consumer, the ancestor of the person today who tries to eat a burrito while navigating a crowded subway station. It taught us that the world doesn't stop for lunch. If you can't carry it with you, it's not progress. It's an anchor. We had perfected the art of eating on the fly, which would soon lead to the hamburger, the hot dog, and the eventual realization that we could spend our entire lives moving from one point to another without ever actually sitting down to think about why we were in such a hurry. The structural integrity of a dream. As the 1904 fair reached its peak, the waffle cone became the unofficial symbol of the Exposition. It was everywhere. Thousands of people wandered the Ivory City, clutching their edible cornucopias, the cream dripping slowly onto their starched lapels. It was a microcosm of the fair itself. It was temporary, like the staff buildings. The cone was designed to disappear. It was a fusion, a blend of Syrian tradition and American demand. It was messy. It required constant attention to prevent a total structural failure. Standing there on the pike, watching a gentleman in a top hat struggle to eat a double-scoop cone before the Missouri sun turned it into a puddle, one could see the entire trajectory of the coming century. We were building a world that was sweet, exciting, and highly portable. But it was also a world that was inherently unstable. We were trading the solid, heavy glass of the 19th century for the crisp, fragile wafer of the 20th. By the time the sun set over the Palace of Agriculture, the vendors had sold millions of them. The penny lick was dead. The dish was obsolete. The waffle cone had won. We had found a way to package the future in a way that tasted like vanilla and burnt sugar, and we were more than happy to swallow it whole. Final inventory of the architecture. Materials, flour, sugar, eggs, and the desperation of a Syrian baker. Structural load, approximately 2 scoops of frozen custard. Any more, and you risk a catastrophic breach of the lower point. Thermal conductivity, high. The heat of your hand is the enemy of the product. Legacy, a billion-dollar industry and the permanent staining of millions of neckties. The waffle cone was the first triumph of the St. Louis Smorgasbord. It was smart, it was efficient, and it was a bit of a scam. It was, in other words, the perfect start to the American century. But as the fairgoers finished their cones and wiped their hands on their souvenir programs, they turned their attention to a new problem. The heat wasn't going away, and the tea was too hot to drink. It was time for the next miracle of 1904. It was time for the ice to meet the brew. Chapter 3. Iced Tea and the Hot Afternoon. The Alchemy of the Chill. If the human race ever decides to hold a formal trial for the climate of St. Louis, Missouri, the primary witness for the prosecution will be the summer of 1904. There is a specific kind of heat found in the American Midwest that does not merely warm the skin, it interrogates the soul. It is a thick, humid, pressurized miasma that makes a man feel as though he is being slowly simmered in a pot of gray wool. By July, the visitors to the Louisiana Purchase Exposition were no longer strolling through the palaces of progress. They were wading through the air, their starched collars having long since surrendered and collapsed into damp rags, looking for any possible excuse to stop existing in a liquid state. It was in this atmosphere of sweltering desperation that humanity stumbled upon its next great beverage revolution. Not through careful laboratory research, but through a fit of pique and a very large block of frozen pond water. The Tea Commissioner's Lament. Enter Richard Blechynden. Blechynden was an Englishman of the old school, a man who believed that the British Empire was built on a foundation of stiff upper lips and piping hot tea. He had been sent to the World's Fair as the Commissioner for Indian Tea, tasked with the noble but doomed mission of convincing the American public that the best way to combat a 100-degree afternoon was to ingest a cup of boiling leaves. In 1904, Americans were largely coffee drinkers, a habit formed during the Revolution as a way of being intentionally annoying to King George. When they did drink tea, they drank it hot, usually in the parlor while discussing things like the gold standard or the scandalous length of a debutante's hemline. Blechynden set up a magnificent pavilion. He had the finest Darjeeling and Assam. He had boiling kettles that whistled with imperial authority. He had free samples. And yet, for the first few weeks of the fair, the American public treated his pavilion as if it were a leper colony. People would walk past, take one look at the steam rising from his pots, and flee toward the nearest fountain to stick their heads under the spout. Observation: there is no missionary work more difficult than trying to sell internal heat to a man who is currently experiencing external combustion. The moment of desperate genius. By the middle of the summer, Blechynden was facing a professional catastrophe. His tea was sitting in the pots, darkening into a bitter sludge that could have been used to strip the varnish off a locomotive. He was losing money, losing his patience, and likely losing his mind. In a moment of frustration that would eventually be worth billions of dollars, Blechynden looked at his steaming cups, looked at the parched, red-faced crowds, and looked at a delivery wagon carrying massive blocks of ice, harvested from northern lakes the previous winter and kept in sawdust-filled cellars. He didn't consult a manual. He didn't ask for permission from the Tea Board of India. He simply took his hot, high-quality tea and poured it directly over a mountain of cracked ice. The transformation was instantaneous. The tea didn't just get cold, it changed its entire social standing. It went from being a medicinal burden to a crystalline miracle. He added a generous helping of sugar because Americans believe that life is a bitter pill that must be coated in corn syrup and a squeeze of lemon. Suddenly, the Indian Tea Pavilion was the most popular spot on the pike. People who wouldn't have touched a hot beverage for $1,000 were now lining up to pay a nickel for a glass of iced tea. The numbing of the American vocal cord. The success of iced tea in 1904 tells us a great deal about the American character. We are a people who value comfort over tradition, and we have a deep spiritual suspicion of anything that requires us to wait for it to cool down. Iced tea was the perfect drink for the 20th century because it allowed for the numbing of the vocal cords. In a hot parlor, people speak slowly, choosing their words with the care of a man walking on thin ice. But when you drink something at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, your throat enters a state of cryogenic shock. It allows you to shout your opinions about the Russo-Japanese War or the price of hogs without the pesky interference of a parched throat. It also introduced the concept of dilution as a virtue. The more the ice melted, the more tea you appeared to have. It was a visual trick that appealed to the more-for-your-money ethos of the St. Louis Smorgasbord. You started with a glass of tea and ended with a glass of tea-flavored water, and as long as it was cold, no one felt cheated. The billion-dollar industry of cold enough. Blechyndens accidental invention, though some claim it existed in the South earlier, he was the one who made it a global sensation, gave birth to a billion-dollar industry. It paved the way for the soda fountains, the refrigerated rail cars, and the eventual American obsession with putting ice in everything, including red wine and beer, much to the horror of the rest of the civilized world. Before 1904, ice was a luxury. It was something you used to keep the meat from walking away on its own. After 1904, ice became a beverage ingredient. We stopped seeing ice as a preservative and started seeing it as a destination. Iced tea became the official drink of the American South, a region that is essentially just St. Louis with better manners and more porch swings. It became the table wine of the South, served in glasses the size of a human head, filled with enough sugar to preserve a cadaver. And it all traces back to that one miserable afternoon in Missouri when a British gentleman finally admitted that tradition is no match for a heat index of 110. The satirical inventory of the glass. The tea, Indian Darjeeling, noble, ancient, and utterly confused by its current surroundings. The ice, harvested from a lake in Wisconsin, containing 4% sawdust and 100% relief. The sugar, liberal amounts, to ensure the consumer forgets they are drinking leaves. The result, a billion-dollar industry and the permanent invention of brain freeze. As the fairgoers stood in the shade of the pavilion, clinking their ice cubes and feeling their internal temperatures drop to a manageable simmer, they were witnessing the end of an era. The 19th century was a hot tea century, formal, slow, and steeped in ritual. The 20th century was going to be an iced tea century, fast, cold, and served in a disposable container. Richard Blechynden didn't just save his business that day. He taught us that in the modern world, it doesn't matter how good your product is if it makes people sweat. If you want to conquer the world, you don't need a better philosophy. You just need a bigger ice cube. Looking ahead, the greasy thumbprint. With the waffle cone in one hand and the iced tea in the other, the citizen of 1904 was now fully armed for the future. They were mobile, they were caffeinated, and they were chilled to the bone. But they were still missing one vital component of the modern diet. They were missing the heavy, savory anchor that would tie the whole experience together. They were missing the hamburger. In the next chapter, we look at how the humble meat patty between two buns officially killed the formal dinner table and replaced the linen napkin with a greasy thumbprint that would eventually cover the entire globe. Chapter 4. The Hamburger's Debut, the Death of the Linen Napkin. By August of 1904, the St. Louis World's Fair had successfully re-engineered the human anatomy. Thanks to the waffle cone, our hands were now sticky. Thanks to iced tea, our internal organs were perpetually confused by the sudden onset of the Arctic. And thanks to the 1,200 acres of walking, our feet had essentially resigned from the Union. But there was one final physiological hurdle to overcome. The 20th century citizen was fast, they were cold, and they were mobile, but they were also profoundly, dangerously hungry. Enter the hamburger. While the 19th century had been the era of dining, a slow ritualistic process involving heavy silver, suspicious sauces, and a great deal of sitting, the 20th century was destined to be the era of feeding. We no longer had time to court our food. We wanted to ambush it on the way to the Palace of Liberal Arts. The 1904 World's Fair served as the official debutante ball for the meat patty between bread, an invention that marked the formal end of the dinner table and the glorious, greasy birth of the modern world. The tyranny of the 12-course meal. To appreciate the revolutionary nature of the hamburger, one must first look back at the culinary prison from which we were escaping. In the Victorian era, a proper dinner was an endurance sport. It involved a minimum of 12 courses, ranging from clear soup that tasted like warm salt to boiled fish that looked like it had given up on life. You were expected to use 6 different forks, each designed for a specific subspecies of shellfish, and you had to maintain a level of posture that suggested you had a broomstick shoved down your waistcoat. It was a world where speed was considered a sign of low breeding, and efficiency was something you only applied to coal mines, never to the consumption of a mutton chop. The World's Fair of 1904 looked at this tradition and laughed. With 20 million people to feed and a pike full of wonders to see, the linen napkin became an obstacle to progress. We needed a meal that could be held in one hand, consumed in 6 bites, and required no more equipment than a sturdy set of incisors and a total lack of shame. Old Dave and the Texas Connection. Like all great American inventions, including the airplane and the light bulb, the origin of the hamburger is shrouded in the fog of historical ego and competing lawsuits. However, the most credible account of its St. Louis debut involves a gentleman from Athens, Texas, named Fletcher Davis, affectionately known as Old Dave. Dave had been selling ground beef patties back in Texas since the 1880s, but he realized that the World's Fair was the ultimate stage for his culinary industrialism. He set up a stand on the pike and began serving Hamburg sandwiches. Though a Hamburg steak had existed before, but it was usually served on a plate with a side of onions and a heavy sense of German heritage. Old Dave's genius was in the delivery system. He took the patty, grilled it until it gave up its moisture in a sizzling protest, placed it between 2 slices of bread, though the rounded bun was still in its experimental phase, and topped it with a thick slice of raw onion and a smear of mustard. The reaction from the fairgoers was not one of refined appreciation, but of primal relief. It was salt, it was fat, and it was portable. For the first time, a man could eat a cow while looking at a statue of a cow made entirely of butter. It was the peak of civilization. The greasy thumbprint, the signature of the new age. The hamburger did more than just fill stomachs. It democratized the calorie. Twain's observation on social equality. A king may eat a partridge and a peasant may eat a turnip, but when they both pick up a hamburger, they both look exactly the same. Specifically, like 2 men trying to avoid dripping hot fat onto their shoes. The hamburger was the great leveler. It didn't care about your pedigree or your bank account. It only cared about your ability to unhinge your jaw. It replaced the formal dinner with the grab and go, a shift that mirrored the frantic energy of the 1904 economy. We were no longer a nation of farmers who sat down when the sun hit the horizon. We were a nation of builders, diggers, and fairgoers who ate while standing up because we were afraid we'd miss the next demonstration of the wireless telegraph. The greasy thumbprint became the new signature of the American worker. It was on our newspapers, our blueprints, and our souvenir programs. It was a sign that we were busy. We had traded the leisurely digestion of the past for the high-octane heartburn of the future, and we couldn't have been happier. The architecture of the bun. While the meat was the star, we must pay homage to the bread. In 1904, the bun was the final frontier of engineering. It had to be soft enough to bite, yet structurally sound enough to contain a miniature lake of beef juice. Before the hamburger, bread was a side dish, something you used to mop up the remnants of a more important meal. With the debut of the burger, the bread became the exoskeleton. It was the protective layer that allowed the human hand to interact with hot grease without sustaining third-degree burns. It was the first edible glove, and it paved the way for every sandwich-based enterprise that would follow, from the humble deli to the global fast food empires that would eventually use more sesame seeds than the earth was ever intended to produce. The final inventory of the smorgasbord. As we conclude Section 1 of our satirical inventory, we find the 1904 fairgoer in a state of peak industrial evolution. Let us look at this magnificent specimen of humanity. In their left hand, a waffle cone, providing a portable, disappearing dessert. In their right hand, a hamburger, providing a savory, efficient anchor. In their pocket, a glass of iced tea, providing the necessary internal refrigeration. In their heart, a profound sense of superiority over the 19th century. We had perfected the three pillars of the 20th century diet: portability, sugar, and grease. We had proven that Americans would build an entire city of plaster just to have a place to eat, standing up. But as the sun set on the Ivory City and the fairgoers finished their burgers, the headlines in the newspapers were beginning to take on a darker tone. The St. Louis Smorgasbord was a beautiful localized dream, but the rest of the world was not nearly as interested in waffle cones as they were in the War of the Rising Sun. Section 2. Global Realignments. The party in St. Louis was about to be interrupted by the cold reality of international politics. While we were arguing about who invented the hamburger, the Russian Empire was discovering that having a large navy is only useful if you remember where you parked it, and Japan was proving that a small island nation can be a very big problem if they have better clocks and more motivation than you. Section 2. Global Realignments. Chapter 5. The Russo-Japanese War begins, swatting the iron fly. While the American public was busy teaching its digestive tract how to handle a hamburger in one hand and a waffle cone in the other, the rest of the planet was engaged in a much more traditional form of entertainment: the systematic dismantling of an empire. By early 1904, the Russian Empire was suffering from a terminal case of geographic hubris. When you own 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, you tend to develop the belief that the world is merely a rug, and you are the only one wearing boots. Tsar Nicholas II, a man whose primary contribution to history was being a devoted family man with the political instinct of a decorative fern, looked toward the Far East and saw a nuisance. He saw Japan. To the Russian aristocracy, Japan was not a power. It was a collection of islands that produced charming ceramics and delicate fans. The Russian High Command referred to the Japanese as monkeys and macaques, assuming that if war ever came, the Russian bear would simply sit on the Japanese islands until they popped. It was a classic 19th century mistake, assuming that a royal pedigree and a very long beard were more effective than a modern navy and a high-explosive shell. The Manchurian real estate crisis. The trouble, as is usually the case with empires, was about a piece of land that neither side actually owned. Both Russia and Japan had looked at Manchuria and Korea and decided that spheres of influence were much more fashionable than sovereign borders. Russia wanted an ice-free port. They had plenty of coastline, but for 9 months of the year, their navy was essentially a collection of very expensive ice sculptures. They had built the Trans-Siberian Railway, a ribbon of steel stretched across a frozen wasteland to connect Moscow to the Pacific. They had leased Port Arthur from China, with the same casual air a billionaire leases a penthouse he intends to wreck. Japan, however, had spent the last 30 years doing something truly terrifying. They had been reading. Since the Meiji Restoration, Japan had looked at the West, taken notes on everything from British steamships to German artillery, and decided to skip the slow industrialization phase and go straight to global superpower. By 1904, Japan was no longer a quaint backdrop for a Gilbert and Sullivan opera. It was a lean, mean 20th century war machine that was tired of being told where it could park its boats. The Midnight Sucker Punch. In 1904, the etiquette of war still demanded a certain amount of preamble. You were supposed to send a series of increasingly huffy letters, recall your ambassadors, and perhaps have a formal dinner where everyone looked at each other with intense, aristocratic loathing. Only then could the shooting start. Japan, apparently, had lost their copy of the rule book. On the night of February 8, 1904, while the Russian officers at Port Arthur were reportedly attending a party for the admiral's wife, a celebration involving a great deal of vodka and a tragic lack of sentries, the Japanese Navy arrived. Led by Admiral Togo Heihachiro, they didn't send a telegram. They sent torpedoes. The Japanese destroyers slipped into the harbor under the cover of darkness and hit 3 of the most powerful ships in the Russian Pacific Fleet. The explosions were the first official announcements of the 20th century. While the Russians were still wiping the caviar from their mustaches and wondering if a boiler had burst, the Japanese were already turning the Russian ice-free port into a flaming scrapyard. Twain's note on diplomacy: starting a war with a torpedo is considered impolite by the loser, but efficient by the winner. In history, efficiency usually gets the better statues. The indignation of the bear. The Russian reaction was one of pure, unadulterated shock. It wasn't just that they had been hit, it was who had hit them. To the Tsar and his court, being attacked by Japan was like being mugged by your own teapot. Nicholas II issued a manifesto dripping with the kind of holy condescension only a Romanov could manage. He called upon the great Russian people to rise up and punish the insolent foe. There was a firm belief in St. Petersburg that the war would be over by lunch. They assumed that once the Russian army, a massive, slow-moving tide of peasants led by men who had won their commissions in ballroom dancing competitions, arrived on the scene, the Japanese would simply apologize and scuttle back to their islands. But the 20th century had a surprise for Russia: the machine gun. As the two armies met in the mountains of Manchuria, the Russians discovered that Slavic courage and religious fervor were poor substitutes for a well-placed bunker. The Japanese soldiers, fueled by a mixture of Bushido spirit and modern military science, were not intimidated by the Tsar's pedigree. They dug in, they stayed quiet, and they used their artillery with the precision of a watchmaker. The Yellow Peril versus the reality of steel. In Europe and America, the newspapers began to churn out cartoons about the Yellow Peril, a racist anxiety that the East was rising to swallow the West. But in the trenches of Manchuria, the peril wasn't a philosophical concept. It was a very real piece of shrapnel. The war was the first time that modern industrial nations fought each other with the full toys of the new century. We saw long-range artillery that could kill you from a different zip code. We saw field telephones used to coordinate mass slaughter. We saw barbed wire, originally intended to keep cows in, being used to keep human beings out, or at least to hold them still long enough to be shot. The Russians were fighting a 19th century war. They brought icons of the Virgin Mary and banners of the saints to the front lines. The Japanese brought maps, rangefinders, and a relentless focus on logistics. It was the first time the world realized that God might not be on the side of the most civilized nation, but on the side of the nation that had the most reliable ammunition supply. The global realignment. The beginning of the Russo-Japanese War sent a shockwave through the St. Louis World's Fair. Suddenly, the Palace of Liberal Arts seemed a bit quaint. People began to gather around the newspaper kiosks, eating their hamburgers and reading about the siege of Port Arthur. It was a sobering realization for the Western world. For centuries, the white empires had assumed they were the only ones allowed to use the high-tech toys. Japan had broken the monopoly. They had proven that the 20th century didn't care about your skin color or your ancient dynasty. It only cared about your rate of fire. As 1904 progressed, the fly didn't just stay swatted, it started winning. Russia, the great hulking colossus of the North, was being picked apart by a neighbor they hadn't bothered to notice a decade earlier. The bear was bleeding, and the rest of the world was starting to wonder if the bear was actually just a very large rug after all. A satirical inventory of the conflict. Russian strategy. Build a very long railroad and hope for the best. Japanese strategy. Hit them while they're eating cake. The winner. Krupp steel and the concept of modernization. The loser. The idea that being an emperor makes you a genius. As the siege lines tightened around Port Arthur, the world settled in for a long, bloody show. The World's Fair was a dream of what humanity could be if we just kept eating waffle cones. The Russo-Japanese War was a reality of what humanity was actually going to be doing for the next 40 years. But while the soldiers in Manchuria were fighting for frozen mud back in the States, a different kind of siege was happening. Teddy Roosevelt was looking at a map of Central America and thinking, you know what this continent needs? A very large hole. Chapter 6. The Siege of Port Arthur, a very expensive view of a hole. While the good people of St. Louis were paying a nickel to see a miniature version of the Boer War reenacted on a pond, the real world was busy producing a version that was significantly less charming and lacked a convenient exit strategy. We move now from the Ivory City of Missouri to the Iron City of the East, Port Arthur. Port Arthur was a strategic harbor that everyone wanted and nobody truly understood. To the Russians, it was their Gibraltar of the East, a warm water port that didn't turn into a solid block of ice the moment a calendar hit November. To the Japanese, it was a dagger pointed at their throat, or at the very least, a very large thumb in their eye. By 1904, it had become the stage for a spectacular demonstration of how many human lives a government is willing to trade for a few yards of frozen mud and a better view of the ocean. The architecture of the ditch. If the 19th century was about the cavalry charge, Men on horses with shiny buttons and a tragic lack of self-preservation, the 20th century, as debuted at Port Arthur, was about the trench. The siege began in earnest in the summer of 1904. The Japanese, led by General Nogi Marisuke, a man who treated his own emotions with the same brutal discipline he applied to his infantry, realized that taking the fort was not going to be a matter of asking politely. The Russians had spent years digging in. They had built forts, redoubts, and trenches. They had essentially turned the landscape into a giant, lethal honeycomb. This was the dress rehearsal for the horrors of the First World War, though the European observers watching from the sidelines mostly spent their time complaining about the quality of the local tea and learning absolutely nothing. They saw the barbed wire, they saw the machine guns, and they concluded that the problem wasn't the technology, but that the Russians and Japanese just weren't being European enough about it. The Maxim gun, the interruption of the human conversation. At Port Arthur, the world was formally introduced to the Maxim gun. Up until this point, war had a certain rhythm. You fire, you reload, you consider your sins, you fire again. The Maxim gun removed the considering phase. It was a mechanical reaper that could fire 600 rounds a minute. It turned a battlefield into a factory floor where the primary product was silence. The Japanese, still clinging to a romanticized version of the samurai spirit, initially tried human wave tactics. They believed that if enough men ran toward the Russian guns with enough banzai spirit, the bullets would eventually get embarrassed and stop hitting them. They were wrong. The bullets had no shame. General Nogi sent wave after wave of his soldiers into the meat grinder of the Russian defenses. It was a mathematical catastrophe. It turned out that the spirit of the warrior is an excellent thing to have, but it is remarkably soft when it meets a lead projectile traveling at 2,000 feet per second. 203-meter hill, the world's most expensive real estate. The climax of this absurdity centered on a lump of dirt known as 203-meter hill. From a distance, it looked like any other hill in Manchuria, gray, rocky, and utterly useless for farming. But if you stood on top of it, you could see down into the harbor where the Russian Pacific Fleet was hiding like a group of nervous penguins. For the Japanese, capturing this hill was a necessity. For the Russians, holding it was a point of pride. For the soldiers, it was a slaughterhouse. Over the course of several months, the hill was bombarded, mined, and fought over with bayonets, rocks, and teeth. The Japanese eventually took it, but the hill was no longer 203 meters high. It had been blasted down by several feet of lead and steel. When the Japanese finally reached the summit and looked down at the Russian ships, they didn't see a grand fleet. They saw a collection of targets. They dragged their 28-centimeter howitzers, massive siege guns that looked like something Jules Verne would use to shoot people to the moon, to the top of the hill. These guns threw shells the size of a grown man, which fell from the sky like the wrath of a very organized god. Within days, the Russian Pacific Fleet was no longer a fleet. It was a series of expensive holes in the water. The luxury of command. While the soldiers were eating frozen horse meat and living in holes filled with their own misery, the leadership on both sides was engaged in a very different kind of war. The Russian commander, General Anatoly Stoessel, was a man of remarkable talents, most of which involved hoarding food and avoiding the front lines. While his men were dying of scurvy and shrapnel, Stoessel was reportedly enjoying fresh vegetables and fine wines within the fortress. He was a firm believer that a general's primary duty was to survive the war, so he could accurately describe how brave everyone else had been. When Stoessel eventually surrendered the fortress in January 1905, without consulting his fellow officers and while still possessing enough ammunition and food to hold out for months, the world was stunned. He didn't surrender because he had to. He surrendered because he was bored and the wine was running low. Twain's rule of military leadership, a general's bravery is often found to be in inverse proportion to the distance between his dinner table and the nearest enemy cannon. The lessons ignored. The siege of Port Arthur ended with a handshake and a great deal of mourning. General Nogi, despite winning, was devastated by the loss of life, including both of his sons. He eventually committed seppuku, a final bloody testament to a code of honor that the 20th century was rapidly making obsolete. The Europeans looked at the maps, the casualty lists, and the spent shell casings, and they wrote long reports. They saw that the defense had won every time until the offense used overwhelming industrialized brutality. They saw that the glory of war had been replaced by the logistics of death. And then they went back to London, Paris, and Berlin, and they began planning their own version of Port Arthur, but on a continental scale. They assumed that what happened in the East was a colonial fluke. They believed that when they fought, the machine guns would be more polite and the barbed wire would be more decorative. They were wrong, of course. 1904 was the warning shot. The world had perfected the art of the siege, the art of the trench, and the art of the mass-produced casualty. We had learned how to kill on an industrial scale. All we needed now was a reason to do it closer to home. A satirical inventory of the siege. Russian assets: 1. Gibraltar, 3 months of caviar, and an admiral who forgot his fleet. Japanese assets: 1 hill, several 100,000 banzai shouts, and a howitzer that could hit a target from the next county. The outcome: the Russian Pacific Fleet becomes a coral reef. General Stoessel becomes a prisoner. General Nogi becomes a tragedy. The legacy: the discovery that humans are much easier to replace than artillery shells. As the smoke cleared over Port Arthur, the global focus shifted. The Russian Empire was in a state of shock. The Japanese were in a state of exhaustion, and the British and French were looking at each other across the English Channel with a very strange expression. They were about to do something truly unthinkable. They were about to become friends. Chapter 7. The Entente Cordiale, the Marriage of Spite. For over 1,000 years, the primary hobby of the English was to set the French on fire. Conversely, the primary hobby of the French was to make the English feel poorly dressed while their houses were burning. This was a relationship built on a bedrock of mutual loathing, linguistic snobbery, and a series of wars so numerous and lengthy that historians eventually stopped naming them and just started numbering them like unpleasant sequels. Between the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and the dawn of the 20th century, if an Englishman and a Frenchman met in a dark alley, the traditional greeting was a sword to the ribs. They fought over land, they fought over religion, and they fought over the correct way to ferment a grape. It was a stable, predictable system of hatred that kept the world in balance. But by April 8th, 1904, something truly unthinkable happened. The two neighbors looked across the English Channel, put down their torches, and signed the Entente Cordiale. In the grand catalogue of human history, this was the equivalent of a cat and a dog deciding to form a joint committee to manage the backyard. It wasn't a formal alliance. The British, who have a pathological fear of commitment, wouldn't go that far. It was a cordial understanding. It was the geopolitical version of "it's complicated." And its primary purpose was to ensure that if the new neighbor, Germany, decided to throw a rock through a window, England and France would be standing together to shout at him. The architect of the picnic, King Edward VII. The man largely responsible for this diplomatic miracle was King Edward VII, known to his friends, and he had many, as Bertie. Edward was the quintessential 1904 man. He was a hedonist of the first order, a man whose waistline was a testament to the glory of French cuisine and whose social life was a direct affront to the stern Victorian values of his mother. Edward realized that the British Empire's policy of splendid isolation was starting to feel a lot more like slightly worrisome loneliness. Germany was building a navy that looked suspiciously like it was designed to cross the Channel, and the Kaiser Wilhelm II, who happened to be Edward's nephew, was a man of such erratic temperament that he made a caffeinated squirrel look stable. In 1903, Edward decided to go to Paris. At the time, the French public hated the British with a passion that bordered on the artistic. When he arrived, the crowds hissed at him. They shouted, "Vive les Boers!" to remind him of the messy war Britain had just finished in South Africa. Edward, however, did not panic. He did not call for his guards. He simply went to the theater, ate the best food in the city, and told everyone how much he loved the spirit of France. By the end of the week, the French were so charmed by this portly, cigar-smoking king who appreciated their wine and their women that they forgot they were supposed to be sharpening their guillotines. He paved the way for the diplomats to sit down and do what they do best: trade things that didn't belong to them. The great colonial swap meet. The Entente Cordiale was not a high-minded declaration of human rights. It was a real estate deal. The two nations sat down with a map of the world and a set of colored pencils and began a process of imperial decluttering. Egypt. The French finally agreed to stop complaining about the British occupation of Egypt. The British got the pyramids, the Sphinx, and a great deal of sand. Morocco. In exchange, the British agreed that France could do whatever it wanted in Morocco. Morocco at the time had not been consulted on this arrangement, but that was a minor detail in 1904. Newfoundland. The French gave up their ancient rights to dry fish on the shores of Newfoundland, a dispute that had been going on since the 1700s. The British, in return, gave them a few bits of West Africa that they weren't using. Siam, Thailand. They divided the country into zones, which is the polite diplomatic way of saying, I get the left side, you get the right side, and try not to touch my stuff. It was a masterpiece of cynicism. They settled every petty grievance they had accumulated over the last century, not because they suddenly liked each other, but because they realized that if they didn't stop bickering, Germany was going to eat their lunch. Twain's rule of diplomacy: true friendship is rarely built on mutual respect. It is almost always built on the discovery of a common person you both find irritating. The Kaiser's tantrum. If the goal of the Entente Cordiale was to annoy Kaiser Wilhelm II, it was a resounding success. Wilhelm was a man of deep insecurities, most of which were manifested in the form of increasingly large battleships and a mustache that defied the laws of physics. When he heard that his Uncle Bertie had made a deal with the French, he took it personally. He felt encircled. He couldn't understand how these two ancient enemies could possibly find common ground. To Wilhelm, the world was a game of risk, and he felt like the other players were whispering about him in the hallway. The German response was to try and break the Entente by causing trouble in Morocco. But, in a classic display of unintended consequences, every time the Kaiser tried to drive a wedge between England and France, he only succeeded in pushing them closer together. By the time 1904 was over, the cordial understanding was hardening into something much more solid. The English were starting to think that perhaps the French weren't so bad, and the French were starting to think that perhaps the English were useful as a shield. The legacy of the handshake. The Entente Cordiale changed the trajectory of the 20th century. It ended the Great Game and set the stage for the Triple Entente. Once Russia limped back from its war with Japan and joined the group, it divided Europe into two armed camps, turning the continent into a giant tinderbox that was just waiting for a spark, or a misguided archduke. But in 1904, it was seen as a triumph of common sense. It was the century of progress at its peak. Two old men in silk hats deciding that it was more profitable to be cordial than to be dead. They celebrated with champagne and parades, blissfully unaware that by resolving their old wars, they were accidentally designing a much larger one. Map of British and French colonial holdings in 1904 showing the areas affected by the Entente. A satirical inventory of the accord. Materials used: high-quality parchment, expensive ink, and several thousand crates of French wine. Winner: Egypt, who got a new boss, Morocco, who got a new owner, and King Edward VII, who got to spend more time in Paris. Loser: the German Kaiser's blood pressure and the traditional British industry of making fun of French accents. The fine print: we are friends as long as that guy over there keeps growing his navy. As the ink dried on the Entente, the world felt a little more stable, even if that stability was built on a foundation of mutual spite. We had successfully rearranged the board. We had traded pyramids for fish-drying rights. We had proven that a cordial understanding is often just a polite way of saying, I'll watch your back if you watch mine, but I'm still keeping my hand on my wallet. But while the diplomats were clinking glasses in London and Paris back across the Atlantic, the Americans were getting tired of just talking about the world. They were ready to move some actual dirt. Section 3. Digging and Driving. Chapter 8. The Panama Canal. Major Surgery on the Earth's Waistline. By May of 1904, the United States had officially decided that the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans had been separated for quite long enough, and it was our manifest destiny to introduce them to one another, whether the geography liked it or not. The project was the Panama Canal, an endeavor so mind-bogglingly expensive and physically improbable that it made the Great Pyramids look like a weekend DIY project in a suburban backyard. To understand the Panama Canal in 1904, one must first understand the American president of 1904. Theodore Roosevelt was a man who viewed the entire planet as a series of obstacles that simply hadn't been punched hard enough yet. He looked at the map of the Western Hemisphere and saw that a ship traveling from New York to San Francisco had to sail 13,000 miles around the bottom of South America, a journey that involved the treacherous Cape Horn and enough time for the crew to grow entire civilizations of barnacles on their chin. T.R. decided that the Isthmus of Panama was nothing more than a stubborn bit of gristle on the world's steak, and he was the man with the knife. The spontaneous revolution of 1903. Before the first shovel could hit the dirt in 1904, there was the small matter of who actually owned the dirt. In 1903, the land belonged to Colombia. The Colombians, displaying a shocking lack of enthusiasm for American progress, were being difficult about the lease. Roosevelt, never a man to let a pesky thing like international law slow down a steam shovel, quietly encouraged a group of Panamanian rebels to have a spontaneous revolution. By spontaneous, I mean the U.S. Navy stood just offshore, looking very muscular and judgmental, until the Colombians decided they had somewhere else to be. Panama became an independent nation on a Tuesday, and by Thursday they had signed a treaty giving the United States a 10-mile wide strip of land forever. It was a masterpiece of political theater, performed for an audience of one, the man with the big stick. Inheriting a French graveyard. When the American engineers arrived in May 1904, they didn't find a clean slate. They found a rusted, vine-choked mechanical cemetery. The French, led by Ferdinand de Lesseps, the man who built the Suez Canal and therefore assumed he was the king of sand, had spent the 1880s trying to dig a sea-level canal through Panama. They failed for two reasons: the Culebra Cut and the mosquito. The French had tried to treat Panama like Egypt, but Egypt is a desert where the primary challenge is not being bored by the sun. Panama is a vertical jungle where it rains enough to dissolve a man's hope. The French dug holes, and the mud filled them back in. They built railroads, and the jungle ate them. More importantly, they died by the thousands of yellow fever and malaria. They thought bad air, miasma, was killing them, so they put the legs of hospital beds in bowls of water to keep ants away, unknowingly creating the perfect nurseries for the very mosquitoes that were murdering them. The mosquito war, quinine and oil. In 1904, the American effort almost suffered the same fate. The first chief engineer, John Wallace, spent most of his time being terrified of the dirt and eventually quit. But then came Colonel William Gorgas, a doctor who had been reading some very interesting papers by a man named Walter Reed. Gorgas announced that the canal could only be built if they first declared war on the mosquito. To the old-school politicians in Washington, this sounded like the ravings of a man who had spent too much time in the sun. They wanted dirt moved. Gorgas wanted to buy window screens and oil. For the first year, the primary weapon of the Panama Canal wasn't the shovel, but the quinine bottle. Gorgas's crews swept through Panama like a manic cleaning service. They drained every puddle, screened every porch, and poured oil on every square inch of standing water. They essentially harassed the Aedes aegypti mosquito until it decided to move to Costa Rica. It was the most expensive extermination project in history, but by the end of 1904, the death rate plummeted. For the first time, a white man could stand in Panama without writing his will first. The Bucyrus, the apex predator of 1904. Once the fever was broken, the real digging began. Roosevelt realized that you cannot fight a mountain with a spoon. He sent in the Bucyrus steam shovels. These were 95-ton monsters of coal and iron. They belched black smoke, roared like dragons, and could move 8 cubic yards of earth in a single bite. They were the physical embodiment of the American 20th century, loud, unstoppable, and entirely indifferent to the local scenery. The challenge was the Culebra Cut, a 9-mile stretch of mountain that refused to stay put. Every time the shovels dug a trench, the mountain would groan and slide back into the hole. It was a battle between American steel and Panamanian gravity. The engineers eventually realized they couldn't just dig a ditch. They had to carve a valley. They began moving enough dirt to build a mountain range elsewhere, all while the railroad, the backbone of the project, shuttled the debris away in a synchronized dance of steam and soot. The architecture of American triumph. By the end of 1904, the French disaster was being transformed into an American triumph. It wasn't just about the dirt anymore. It was about the system. Under John Stevens, the new chief engineer, the canal became a giant factory. He realized that the canal was, at its heart, a railroad problem. You had to get the dirt out faster than the mountain could put it back in. Twain's rule of progress: you can move a mountain if you have enough steam shovels and a total disregard for the geological feelings of the mountain. But you can only finish the job if you remember to build a railroad to carry the mountain away. The Americans also decided to ditch the French idea of a sea-level canal. They decided to build a bridge of water, a series of massive locks that would lift ships 85 feet into the air, sail them across a man-made lake, and set them back down on the other side. It was an engineering audacity that suggested that if the Atlantic and Pacific weren't at the same level, we would simply rewrite the laws of physics until they were. A Satirical Inventory of the Ditch, 1904 edition. Total dirt, moved enough to bury the state of Rhode Island, though many argued Rhode Island deserved it. Primary fuel, bituminous coal, and the sheer unbridled ego of Theodore Roosevelt. Medicinal requirement, several tons of quinine which tasted like a bitter divorce but kept the heart beating. The spontaneous element, 1 U.S. Navy gunboat and a brand new flag for Panama. The goal: to save 3 weeks of sailing and ensure that the United States could move its navy from one side of the world to the other before the enemy had finished their lunch. As 1904 drew to a close, the Panama Canal was no longer a dream or a graveyard. It was a construction site the size of a country. We were performing major surgery on the Earth's waistline, and we were doing it without anesthesia. It was the ultimate statement of the new century. The world is not a fixed map. It is a suggestion that we are currently editing. But while the Americans were digging holes in Panama, the citizens of New York were discovering that they didn't need to go to the tropics to live in a hole. They just needed a nickel and a ride on the IRT. Chapter 9. The NYC subway opens, breathing the Devonian for a nickel. While the Americans in Panama were busy proving they could cut a continent in half, the Americans in New York City were engaged in a project of equal audacity and significantly more claustrophobia. For years, the people of Manhattan had lived their lives in two dimensions. They could go north or they could go south, usually while dodging horse manure or being rained upon by the soot of the L's, the elevated trains that screeched overhead like iron banshees. But by October 27, 1904, the city decided that the surface of the earth was entirely too crowded and that the only logical solution was to bury the populace alive. It was the birth of the Interborough Rapid Transit, IRT, the first successful underground subway in New York. It was an engineering marvel that promised to whisk a man from City Hall to 145th Street in a record-breaking 26 minutes, provided he didn't mind spending those 26 minutes in a tube filled with the air of a prehistoric tomb and the proximity of 300 strangers who hadn't discovered the joys of the daily bath. The Silver Controller and the Mayoral Joyride. The opening of the subway was not a quiet affair. In 1904, New York did not do quiet. It was a day of parades, top hats, and a level of civic self-congratulation that suggested the city had just invented the concept of the wheel. The hero of the hour was Mayor George McClellan, Jr., a man who, like many politicians of the era, viewed a ribbon-cutting ceremony as a personal spiritual experience. He was presented with a ceremonial silver controller, a device designed to make him look like he was in charge, while the actual engineer stood behind him, praying he didn't accidentally launch the train into a brick wall. The plan was simple. The mayor would drive the first train for a few blocks, wave to the crowds, and then hand the controls to a professional motorman. However, the mayor discovered something that every child with a toy train already knows. Power is addictive. McClellan got what the newspapers called throttle fever. He gripped the silver handle and refused to let go. He drove that train through the tunnels of Manhattan like a man possessed by the ghost of a Kentucky Derby jockey. The actual motorman, a fellow named Frank Headley, stood behind the mayor, presumably wondering if his pension covered death by mayoral enthusiasm. As McClellan sped past the ceremonial stops at 30 miles per hour, laughing as the lights of the stations blurred into a golden streak. Twain's observation on political momentum. If you give a politician a silver handle and tell him he's moving the world, he will rarely stop until he hits a wall or an election. In the case of the IRT, the mayor simply hit 145th Street and looked disappointed that the tracks didn't continue into the Atlantic. The psychology of the underworld. Before the opening, there was a genuine psychological barrier to the subway. You have to remember that in 1904, the underworld was still largely a theological concept involving pitchforks and eternal regret. To ask a God-fearing citizen to step into a dark hole in the ground and pay 5 cents for the privilege was a difficult sell. People were worried about subway air. There were doctors who claimed that breathing the air beneath the city would lead to a specific kind of subterranean tuberculosis, or that the electrical vibrations of the third rail would scramble a man's brains until he could no longer remember his own name or his wife's birthday. But the New York character is built on a foundation of two things: a hatred of being late and a love of a bargain. When the doors finally opened to the public at 7 p.m. on that October evening, the fear of the underworld was instantly replaced by the thrill of the 5-cent fare. Over 150,000 people flooded the stations in the first few hours. They marveled at the palaces of the underground. The stations were decorated with ornate tiles, brass fixtures, and chandeliers. It was as if the city had decided that if we were going to live like moles, we might as well be moles of high social standing. The atmosphere, a cocktail of ozone and iron. Now, we must address the sensory experience of the 1904 subway. It was not the climate-controlled, plastic-seated experience of the modern era. The cars were made of wood, a brilliant choice for a tunnel filled with high-voltage electricity, and were illuminated by flickering incandescent bulbs that gave every passenger the sickly pallor of a man who had been dead for 3 days. The air was the real star of the show. I call it Devonian air, because it felt as though it hadn't seen the sun since the Paleozoic era. It was a thick, humid cocktail composed of ozone, produced by the sparking third rail, giving the tunnels the scent of a thunderstorm that had been trapped in a closet. Iron dust, created by the constant grinding of metal wheels against metal tracks, which settled on your lungs and gave your morning coffee a distinct metallic tang. Humanity, specifically, the perspiration of 15,000 men in wool suits and women in 14 layers of petticoats, all compressed into a space designed for 6. Despite the smell, or perhaps because of it, New Yorkers felt a sense of rugged pride. They were the subterraneans. They were moving faster than the wind, beneath the feet of the horses, through a world of shadows and steel. They had conquered the earth. The social experiment, the great leveler. The subway did something that the L's and the carriages never could. It forced the social classes to look at one another in the dark. In 1904, New York was a city of rigid hierarchies. The wealthy lived on the avenues, the poor lived in the tenements, and they rarely met unless one was serving the other soup. But the subway was the great leveler. For 5 cents, a banker from Wall Street could find himself pressed rib to rib with a dock worker from the Lower East Side. They shared the same iron dust, the same flickering light, and the same collective lurch when the motorman took a corner too fast. It was a radical democratic experiment conducted in a sewer. It taught New Yorkers that while they might live in different worlds on the surface, they were all in the same boat, or rather the same wooden box, underground. It fostered a specific kind of New York closeness that persists to this day. The ability to stand 2 inches from a stranger's face and pretend they don't exist. The legacy of the ditch. By the end of 1904, the subway was already a permanent fixture of the city's soul. It had proven that the change of pace we discussed at the start of this inventory was not just a metaphor, it was a physical reality. We had traded the slow, sunlit rhythm of the 19th century for the fast, neon-lit, or at least bulb-lit, frenzy of the 20th. The subway allowed New York to grow vertically. Without the IRT, the skyscraper would have been a lonely monument. With it, the skyscraper became a hive. You could now live in the Bronx and work at the tip of Manhattan without spending your entire life on the back of a horse. We had shrunk the city, expanded the day, and turned the 5-cent nickel into the most powerful key in the world. A satirical inventory of the underworld. The fare, 1 nickel. The only thing in New York that hasn't changed its value in spirit, even if it has in price. The speed, 30 miles per hour. Fast enough to feel like time travel, slow enough to see the rats. The decor, Hines and Lafarge tiles, proving that even a tunnel can be a work of art if you have enough mortar. The hazard: throttle fever among city officials and the occasional wooden car fire. The lesson: if you want to move 1,000,000 people, you have to convince them that being buried alive is a convenience. As the last train rattled through the tunnels on December 31st, 1904, New Yorkers looked at the world differently. They were no longer limited by the horizon. They were limited only by the length of the track. They were a people on the move, breathing iron dust and dreaming of the future. But while the masses were clattering through the dark for a nickel, two gentlemen in England were having a handshake that would ensure the wealthy would never have to breathe subway air ever again. They were about to create a car so quiet you could hear a fly sneeze on the radiator. Chapter 10. The Rolls-Royce Handshake. The Silence of the Elites. While the huddled masses in New York were currently engaged in the communal ritual of breathing ozone and iron dust for a nickel, the year 1904 was also busy catering to the other end of the social spectrum. You see, the 20th century had a very specific plan for the wealthy. It wanted to ensure that while the poor moved faster, the rich moved with such profound silence that they might actually forget the rest of the world existed. In May of 1904, at the Midland Hotel in Manchester, England, a meeting took place that would forever change the sound, or rather, the lack thereof, of the open road. It was the meeting of Charles Rolls and Henry Royce. It was a handshake between old money and new tools, between a man who loved speed and a man who hated noise, and it resulted in a machine so quiet that the only thing you could hear while driving it was the sound of your own social standing rising. The engineer, Henry Royce, and the war on friction. To understand the Rolls-Royce, you must first understand Henry Royce. Royce was a man who viewed a mechanical vibration with the same visceral horror that a priest views a blasphemy. He was a self-made engineer who had worked his way up from poverty, and he brought to the automotive world a level of obsessive-compulsive precision that would have made a Swiss watchmaker look like a blacksmith with a sledgehammer. Before the meeting, Royce had bought a French car, a Decauville, and found it to be a noisy, clattering heap of Gallic indifference. He didn't just complain about it. He took it apart, looked at every nut and bolt, and decided he could do better. He built 3 cars of his own design, known as Royces. They were 2-cylinder machines that produced a staggering 10 horsepower, which in 1904 was enough to outrun a particularly athletic horse, provided the horse wasn't in a hurry. The defining characteristic of a Royce car was its silence. Royce believed that friction was a sin and that noise was a sign of mechanical failure. He hand-polished every moving part until it fit with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. When his first car started up, his neighbors reportedly didn't even notice, which, in an era where most cars sounded like a bucket of gravel in a cement mixer, was considered a form of witchcraft. The salesman, Charles Rolls, and the need for speed. Then there was Charles Rolls. If Royce was the brain, Rolls was the face and the heavy right foot. Rolls was an aristocrat, the son of Lord and Lady Langaddock, and a man who treated danger like a personal valet. He was a pioneer in balloons, an early aviator, and a car dealer who sold expensive European imports to people who had more money than sense. Rolls was looking for a British-made car that could compete with the French and the Germans. He wanted something reliable, but more importantly, he wanted something he could sell to a duke without the duke's hat falling off from the engine's vibrations. When a mutual friend told him about a quiet little car being built in Manchester by a man who never slept, Rolls was skeptical. He agreed to the meeting, but only if Royce came to London. Royce, being a man of practical labor and zero patience for aristocratic whims, refused. He told Rolls that if he wanted to see the car, he could come to Manchester. It was the first power move in the history of the company, and it worked. Rolls took the train to Manchester, saw the car, and within minutes of driving it, realized he was looking at the future. Twain's rule of partnership. A great business is usually composed of one man who knows how to make something and another man who knows how to make people believe they can't live without it. The handshake, the deal of the century. The agreement they struck at the Midland Hotel was simple. Royce would build the cars and Rolls would sell them. But there was a catch. The cars would be called Rolls-Royce. In the world of 1904, this was a radical branding move. It took the technical genius of the working-class engineer and tied it to the social prestige of the aristocratic salesman. It created a brand that wasn't just a car. It was a certificate of achievement. To own a Rolls-Royce was to announce to the world that you had reached a level of success where the laws of physics, specifically those regarding noise and heat, no longer applied to you. The price of silence. We must discuss the price tag. A Rolls-Royce was not expensive in the way a fancy suit is expensive. It was expensive in the way a small European principality is expensive. In an era where a common laborer might earn a few dollars a week, a Rolls-Royce could cost several thousand. But what were you buying? You weren't just buying transportation. You were buying the Silver Ghost ethos, though that specific model would arrive a few years later. You were buying a car so reliable that the company would eventually claim they didn't even provide a toolkit because the car would never break down. You were buying a radiator that looked like a Greek temple, a design that suggested the engine wasn't just a machine, but a deity that demanded worship. In 1904, the motor car was still largely a hobby for the idle rich, men who enjoyed wearing goggles and being covered in dust while shouting at peasants. The Rolls-Royce changed the narrative. It turned the car into a carriage without the horses. It was the final nail in the coffin for the four-legged transportation industry. Why deal with a creature that has a mind of its own and requires constant hay, when you could have a machine that whispered along the road at 30 miles per hour? The social divide, subways versus sedans. As 1904 drew to a close, the divide in human movement was becoming clear. The subway was for the many. It was fast, efficient, subterranean, and smelled of the collective. It was the heartbeat of the industrial city. The Rolls-Royce was for the few. It was quiet, private, elevated, and smelled of expensive leather and polished wood. It was the sanctuary of the elite. We had created a world where you could travel across a city for a nickel, but you could only travel in style for a fortune. The Rolls-Royce handshake ensured that the 20th century would be one of stratified speed. We were all going faster, but some of us were doing it while hearing the clock tick, while the rest of us were just trying to hear ourselves think over the screech of the IRT's brakes. A satirical inventory of the handshake. The participants: one engineer with a grudge against noise, one aristocrat with a grudge against slow things. The location: the Midland Hotel, where the bill for lunch was likely more than the cost of a horse. The product: the 10-horsepower Royce, a car so quiet it was actually dangerous to pedestrians who weren't paying attention. The legacy: a brand that became the international gold standard for "I have more money than you." The hidden cost: the realization that silence is the most expensive commodity in a world that is getting louder by the second. Henry Royce once said, "Small things make perfection, but perfection is no small thing." In 1904, he and Rolls proved that if you focus on the small things, the tiny vibrations, the silent gears, the polished valves, you can create something that feels like it was built by angels and priced by accountants. But as the wealthy drove their silent cars through the streets of London and the New Yorkers rattled through the tunnels of Manhattan, the calendar was turning toward the end of the year. The digging and driving section of our inventory was complete. We had conquered the earth and the road. Now, it was time to look at the other great spectacle of 1904, a display of human prowess so bafflingly incompetent that it makes every other event in this book look like a master class in organization. Section 4. The Olympic Circus. Chapter 11. The 1904 St. Louis Marathon, a slow-motion riot. By late August 1904, the St. Louis World's Fair had successfully convinced the public that humanity was a pinnacle of achievement. We had the waffle cone, the light bulb, and a canal that was currently dissecting Panama. It was only natural, then, that we should round off this celebration of progress with a display of peak physical prowess: the Olympic Games. However, the 1904 Olympics were not the polished billion-dollar broadcast of spandex and sponsorships we know today. They were a disorganized sideshow held in the middle of a Missouri heatwave, and the marathon, the crown jewel of the event, was less an athletic competition and more of a clinical study in how much abuse the human body can take before it simply decides to stop being a participant in the universe. The man in charge was James Sullivan, a sports official with a mustache that suggested authority and a scientific mind that suggested he had recently been kicked in the head by a mule. Sullivan had a theory. He believed in purposeful dehydration. He wanted to test the limits of human endurance by denying the runners water. In a St. Louis summer, where the humidity is thick enough to support a family of 4, Sullivan provided only 2 water stops for a 25-mile race. It was a strategy that shifted the goal of the race from winning to not turning into a human raisin. The starting line, a collection of misfits. The 32 men who stood at the starting line on August 30th were a diverse group of athletes, dreamers, and people who had clearly made a wrong turn on their way to the concession stand. There were professional long-distance runners, of course, but there was also Anderin Carvajal, a Cuban mailman who had raised money for his trip by running across Cuba and then lost all of it in a dice game in New Orleans. He arrived at the starting line in long trousers, a white shirt, and heavy street shoes. A fellow athlete took pity on him and cut his pants into shorts with a pair of scissors. Then there were Len Tounyen and John Mashiani, 2 Tswana tribesmen from South Africa who were in town as part of the Boer War exhibit at the fair. They weren't even supposed to be in the Olympics. They were just there to show off South African culture, but they decided to join the race because they liked running. They were the first black Africans to compete in the modern Olympics, and they did so with no shoes and zero idea that the race was about to become a horror movie. The course, dust, hills, and feral dogs. The race began at 3 p.m., the hottest part of the day, on a course that consisted of 7 massive hills and roads covered in several inches of fine, powdery dust. As the runners moved, they kicked up a cloud of grit that settled into their lungs, creating a condition that doctors later described as permanent internal sanding. The logistics were handled by men in horseless carriages, who drove ahead of the runners, kicking up even more dust and occasionally running into things. It was a motorized catastrophe. 10 miles into the race, Lentanyane was doing remarkably well until he was suddenly chased nearly a mile off course by a pack of aggressive feral dogs. In any other Olympics, being hunted by wolves would be considered a valid reason for a do-over. In 1904, it was just another Tuesday in Missouri. Tanyane eventually managed to shake the dogs and return to the course, still finishing 9th, proving that a South African mail carrier is significantly harder to kill than a St. Louis stray. The waffle of the Cuban mailman. Meanwhile, Anderine Carvajal was treating the Olympic marathon as a leisurely sightseeing tour. Despite not having eaten for 40 hours, he was leading the pack for a significant portion of the race. However, his stomach eventually staged a coup. Seeing an orchard on the side of the road, Carvajal stopped to snack on some apples. Unfortunately, the apples were rotten and had fermented in the Missouri sun. He developed such severe stomach cramps that he decided the only logical course of action was to lie down in the grass and take a nap. He slept for a significant amount of time, woke up, stretched, and proceeded to finish the race in 4th place. Had he not been sidelined by a piece of fruit and a dream, the man in the cut-off trousers would likely have won the gold. The man in the car, Fred Lors. Then there was Fred Lors. About 9 miles into the race, Lors developed severe cramps and decided that endurance was a vastly overrated concept. He hailed a passing automobile and hitched a ride for the next 11 miles. He waved at the other runners as he sped past them, presumably while enjoying the breeze and the lack of dust in his throat. When the car eventually broke down, Lors, feeling refreshed and perhaps a bit bored, hopped out and ran the final few miles to the finish line. He crossed first, was crowned the winner, and was just about to have his photo taken with Alice Roosevelt, the president's daughter, when someone pointed out that he had spent half the race in a Ford. Lors claimed it was all just a joke, which is the traditional defense of a man caught cheating at the highest level of international sport. Sullivan, not being a fan of Lors's brand of humor, banned him for life, a ban that lasted exactly 1 year. The winner, Thomas Hicks and the rat poison diet. With Lors disqualified, the true winner was Thomas Hicks. But Hicks didn't win through athleticism. He won through a cocktail of chemistry that would make a modern lab technician faint. By the 20-mile mark, Hicks was ready to die. He was hallucinating, his skin was gray, and he was begging his trainers for water. Sticking to Sullivan's dehydration plan, his trainers refused water. Instead, they gave him strychnine, commonly known as rat poison, mixed with egg whites. When that didn't perk him up, they gave him a second dose, followed by a large swig of brandy. Hicks spent the last 2 miles of the race in a state of chemical purgatory. He was being physically supported by his trainers as his feet shuffled across the ground in a rhythmic, terrifying spasm. He believed the finish line was still 20 miles away when it was right in front of him. When he finally crossed the line, he had lost 8 pounds and had to be carried off the field by 4 men. He was so close to death that he couldn't even stand to receive his medal. He was the Olympic champion, but he looked like a man who had just lost a fight with a tractor. The verdict of the circus. The 1904 marathon was the perfect ending to the Olympic circus. Out of 32 starters, only 14 finished. It was a race where the winner was poisoned. The 4th place finisher took a nap, the 9th place finisher was hunted by dogs, and the guy who won first did so in a car. Twain's closing thought: the 1904 marathon proved that if you put enough Americans, South Africans, and Cubans in a dusty hole and tell them to run, they will do so until they either die or find a better way to travel. It was a monument to human stupidity, but also to human resilience. We are a species that will walk through fire for a medal made of tin, provided someone gives us enough brandy and rat poison to forget why we're doing it. The Olympic organizers looked at the results and concluded that they should probably never let Sullivan organize a race again. But for the rest of the world, 1904 remained the gold standard for the most ridiculous afternoon in history. But the Olympic circus wasn't over. While the runners were recovering from their strychnine hangovers, the fair organizers were preparing for Anthropology Days, an event that would prove that the only thing primitive about the 20th century was the minds of the people running it. Chapter 12. Anthropology Days, the Special Olympics of Scientific Racism. If the 1904 marathon was a master class in how to nearly kill several dozen people with rat poison and thirst, the event that followed it, the so-called Anthropology Days, was a master class in how to be profoundly, scientifically, and hilariously wrong about the entire human species. Having already proven that they couldn't organize a foot race without a car and a pack of feral dogs getting involved, James Sullivan and his partner in high-minded nincompoopery, W.J. McGee, the fair's head of anthropology, decided it was time to turn their attention to science. Specifically, they wanted to prove a theory that was very popular among people who wore pith helmets in air-conditioned offices. The theory that the white man was the peak of evolutionary achievement, and everyone else was just a rough draft. To prove this, they organized a 2-day athletic competition on August 12th and 13th, 1904. They rounded up the living exhibits from the various villages on the fairgrounds: the Igorot from the Philippines, the Ainu from Japan, the Patagonians from South America, and the Pygmies from Central Africa, and told them to compete in Western sports. It was essentially the Special Olympics of colonial arrogance, and it went about as well as a fish attempting to compete in a bicycle race. The masterminds, McGee and the measuring tape. W.J. McGee was a man who believed that you could measure a person's soul with a stopwatch and a pair of calipers. He was obsessed with human progress, which he viewed as a linear ladder with himself at the top and everyone else somewhere near the basement. The plan was to have these primitives compete in things like the shot put, the long jump, and the 100-yard dash. McGee and Sullivan predicted that the savages would fail miserably because they lacked the refined nervous systems and moral discipline of the Anglo-Saxon athlete. They didn't consider the possibility that the savages might fail simply because they had no idea what a 100-yard dash was or why any sane person would want to do one in 100-degree heat for no reason. Twain's rule of scientific bias. If you set out to prove that your neighbor is an idiot, you will almost certainly find evidence of it, especially if you insist on testing his intelligence by asking him to recite poetry in a language he doesn't speak while you poke him with a stick. The events. A study in confusion. The competition began with a level of confusion that bordered on the theatrical. The athletes were brought to the stadium, where they were met with a crowd of curious, popcorn-munching fairgoers and a group of frantic officials waving clipboards. 1. The 100-yard dash. The organizers lined up a group of pygmies in Igorot at the starting line. When the starting pistol went off, a sound that usually signifies danger in most parts of the world, the runners didn't bolt toward the finish line. Some of them stayed at the start, wondering why the man with the hat was shooting at the sky. Others ran halfway, got bored, and wandered off to talk to the spectators. To McGee, this was scientific proof of their inability to focus. To the runners, it was a perfectly rational response to a meaningless task. 2. The shot put. The shot put was perhaps the most baffling event of all. The primitives were handed a heavy iron ball and told to throw it as far as they could. Most of them looked at the ball, realized it wasn't edible, and didn't seem to see the point of moving it from point A to point B. One contestant reportedly threw it once, watched where it landed, and then walked over, picked it up, and brought it back to the official, assuming the man had simply dropped it by accident. 3. The mud fight. Perhaps the most offensive addition to the program was the mud fight, which wasn't an Olympic sport, but was included because Sullivan thought it would be entertaining. It was exactly what it sounds like, a group of grown men being encouraged to throw mud at each other to prove their primitive combativeness. The participants mostly looked embarrassed, while the organizers took notes on their natural aggression. The scientific results. At the end of the 2 days, McGee and Sullivan had exactly what they wanted. A pile of data showing that the tribal participants were slower, weaker, and less coordinated than the professional athletes of the Western world. They ignored the fact that the Western athletes had been training for years, while the primitives had been recruited from their lunch an hour before the race. Below is a summary of the findings that the organizers used to justify their worldview. Event. Civilized record. Primitive result. Organizers' conclusion. 100-yard dash. 9.6 seconds. 14.2 seconds. Lack of evolutionary drive. Shot put. 48 feet. 31 feet. Inferior skeletal leverage. Broad jump. 24 feet. 15 feet. Inability to grasp the concept of distance. Spear throw. N/A. Remarkable. Irrelevant skill in the age of the rifle. The only event where the primitives actually excelled was the spear throw, because it was a skill they actually used for survival. However, McGee dismissed this result, claiming that it was merely a reflexive animalistic talent that didn't count toward real athletic progress. The irony of the primitive mind. The great irony of anthropology days was that the only people acting like primitives were the ones wearing the suits. While McGee was busy trying to prove that the pygmies were closer to the ape, the pygmies were busy laughing at him. One pygmy, a man named Ota Benga, who would later have a much more tragic history, was particularly adept at highlighting the absurdity of the fare. When asked to perform his traditional dances, he would often add, in a bit of soft shoe or a comedic flourish he had seen in the city, much to the annoyance of the anthropologists who wanted authentic savagery. The savages weren't failing because they were inferior. They were failing because they were uninterested. They were a group of people being asked to participate in a culture they didn't respect for a goal they didn't value, under the supervision of men they didn't like. They were essentially trolling the entire scientific community of 1904, and the scientists were too self-important to notice. The fallout, a disgrace to the games. Even in 1904, not everyone was impressed by Sullivan's anthropology days. Pierre de Coubertin, the founder of the modern Olympics, was so disgusted by the spectacle that he refused to attend. He wrote, "It will, of course, lose its edge when it is actually seen that those who were expected to be inferior are often superior to us. But as for the anthropology days, they were simply a disgrace to the Olympic name." Coubertin realized what Sullivan and McGee hadn't. That sport is a universal language, but you have to actually speak to the people you're inviting to the conversation. You can't just shout at them in a foreign tongue and then complain that they have no manners. The final verdict of the circus. By the time the Olympic circus left town, the reputation of the St. Louis Games was in tatters. Between the rat-poison marathon and the racist field days, the Olympics had become a parody of themselves. It would take another 20 years for the Games to recover their dignity, and even then, they never quite reached the level of pure, unadulterated nonsense achieved in 1904. Anthropology days proved one thing very clearly. The measure of a man is not found in his 100-yard dash time or the shape of his skull. It is found in his ability to look at a man with a stopwatch and say, "I'm not doing that. It's hot out." The savages went back to their villages, presumably to tell stories about the strange, pale-skinned men who spent their lives running in circles and throwing iron balls at the ground. Meanwhile, the anthropologists went back to their universities to write books that would be laughed at by the next generation of students. Section 4 was finally over. The athletes were gone, the dust had settled, and the primitive tribes had survived the civilized scrutiny. It was time to return to the world of normal human achievement, specifically to a man in Boston who was about to prove that if you throw a small white ball 60 times and nobody hits it, you can become a god. Chapter 13. Cy Young's Perfect Game, a miraculous failure of social interaction. While the rest of the world was busy being horrified by the medical experimentation of the St. Louis Marathon, or the scientific theater of anthropology days, a much more refined and mathematically elegant form of human folly was taking place in Boston. On May 5, 1904, at the Huntington Avenue grounds, a man named Denton True Cy Young performed a feat that, in any other context, would be considered a profound breakdown of interpersonal communication. He threw a small leather-bound ball 60 feet and 6 inches toward 27 different men, and not a single one of them managed to touch it in a meaningful way. In a grocery store, this would be cause for an arrest. In a church, it would be a disturbance of the peace. But in Boston, it was a religious epiphany that would be whispered about for the next century. The man they called Cyclone. By 1904, Cy Young was already a living relic of the 19th century. He was 37 years old, an age that in the Edwardian era was considered roughly 3 years past ancient. He looked less like a modern athlete and more like a man who had been carved out of a single piece of Ohio oak and then dressed in a baggy woolen pajama set. Young was a man of few words and many strikes. He didn't believe in the theatrics of the modern game. He didn't scream at umpires, he didn't flip his bat, and he certainly didn't chase fire engines, which was more than could be said for his rival that day, Rube Waddell. Young's nickname, Cy, was short for Cyclone. Legend has it he earned the name because his fastball once demolished a wooden fence with such violence that it looked like a storm had passed through. By 1904, the Cyclone had slowed down a bit, but he had replaced sheer velocity with something much more terrifying: absolute, unwavering accuracy. He could throw a ball through a wedding ring from across a street, and he did so with the rhythmic, mechanical indifference of a grandfather clock. The antagonist, Rube Waddell and the fire engine. To understand the perfection of Cy Young, you must understand the chaos of his opponent, Rube Waddell of the Philadelphia Athletics. If Cy Young was the order of the 20th century, Rube Waddell was the disorder of every century combined. Waddell was perhaps the most talented pitcher in history, but he had the attention span of a moth in a lighthouse. He was known to leave the pitcher's mound in the middle of a game if he heard a fire engine siren nearby, sprinting out of the stadium to help the firemen pull the hoses. He wrestled alligators in his spare time, disappeared for weeks to join the circus, and once missed a game because he was distracted by a pile of shiny rocks. Before the game on May 5th, Waddell had been taunting Young, telling the press that the old man was washed up. It was a classic 1904 mistake, taunting a man who spent his winters on an Ohio farm thinking about the most efficient way to throw things at people. The anatomy of perfection. The perfect game is the rarest jewel in sports because it requires 27 consecutive moments of absolute cooperation from the universe. No hits, no walks, no errors, no hit batsmen. If a single fielder trips over a stray blade of grass, or if the umpire has a momentary lapse in vision caused by a stray bit of tobacco juice, the perfection evaporates. As the game progressed, the Huntington Avenue grounds underwent a psychological transformation. In the early innings, the crowd was loud, shouting insults at Waddell and cheering for the home team Boston Americans. But by the 6th inning, a strange, heavy silence began to settle over the park. Baseball fans are the most superstitious creatures on the planet. They believe that if you mention a no-hitter or a perfect game while it is happening, you will personally cause the next batter to hit a home run through the sheer force of your own jinx. By the 8th inning, 10,000 people were sitting in a state of self-imposed muteness. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. If a man had a cough, he likely swallowed it at the risk of his own life. Twain's observation on superstition. We like to think of ourselves as a scientific race, yet we are the only species that believes a man's ability to throw a ball is affected by whether or not a stranger in the third row changes the way his legs are crossed. The mathematical failure of the Athletics. The Philadelphia Athletics were not bad hitters. They were just currently engaged in a mathematical impossibility. Cy Young was painting the black, throwing the ball to the very edge of the strike zone, where it is technically a strike, but physically impossible to hit with any authority. One by one, the Philadelphia batters trudged to the plate, waved their wooden sticks at the air, and returned to the dugout with the expressions of men who had just been cheated at cards. There were no close calls. There were no spectacular diving catches. It was just a steady, relentless march of outs. In terms of social interaction, it was a disaster. The Athletics were trying to start a conversation, and Cy Young was simply hanging up the phone 27 times in a row. The final out. By the ninth inning, the tension in the stadium was thick enough to be sold as a souvenir. Rube Waddell himself was the final batter, a bit of poetic justice that the universe rarely provides, but occasionally indulges in. Waddell stepped up, took a mighty swing, and hit a fly ball to center field. As the ball hung in the Missouri-scented Boston air, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. The center fielder, Chick Stahl, caught the ball, and the perfect game was complete. The score was 3-0. The hits were 0. The errors were 0. For the first time in the modern era of baseball, a man had been perfect. The crowd didn't just cheer. They stormed the field. They didn't want to hurt Cy Young. They wanted to touch him, perhaps hoping that some of his miraculous stability would rub off on their own chaotic 1904 lives. The religious epiphany in Boston. To the rest of the country, it was a sports headline. To Boston, it was a sign from above. In a year where we were losing wars in the East and dying of rat poison in St. Louis, Cy Young had provided a moment of absolute, unassailable order. He had proven that if you are careful enough, disciplined enough, and perhaps a little bit lucky, you can achieve a state of grace where nothing, not even a Rube Waddell, can touch you. It was a religious epiphany in the Church of the Small White Ball. Young, true to his nature, didn't make a speech. He didn't celebrate with champagne. He likely just wiped his forehead, went to the clubhouse, and started thinking about his next start. He had done his job. He had been perfect, and in the 20th century, being perfect was a full-time occupation that left very little room for conversation. A satirical inventory of the perfection. Number of pitches, extremely few. Young was famously efficient. He didn't believe in wasting a throw. Number of fire engines, chased 0. Cy Young. At least one. Rube Waddell, probably in his mind. The atmosphere, a mixture of extreme tension and the smell of stale peanuts. The result, the first perfect game of the 20th century and the permanent canonization of a man who looked like an oak tree. The lesson, if you want to be remembered for a century, don't talk to anyone, just keep hitting your targets. As Cy Young walked off the field that day, he left behind a world that was getting faster, louder, and much more complicated. But for 2 hours in May, he had slowed it all down. He had brought the change of pace to a screeching halt. But while Boston was celebrating its new god, the rest of the country was turning its attention back to the man who was currently acting as the god of the entire Western Hemisphere. It was time to look at the Roosevelt corollary, and the moment Uncle Sam officially traded his top hat for a badge and a nightstick. Section 5. Domestic Distractions. Chapter 14. The Roosevelt Corollary. Uncle Sam's New Badge. By the winter of 1904, Theodore Roosevelt had realized that being the President of the United States was, in many ways, quite similar to being the headmaster of a particularly rowdy boarding school. He spent his days dealing with people who wouldn't share their toys, countries that refused to pay their debts, and a European faculty that was constantly trying to sneak into the backyard to see if the fruit trees were ripe. Roosevelt, a man whose resting state was one of vigorous irritation, decided that the existing rules were no longer sufficient for a nation that was currently digging a canal in Panama and throwing perfect games in Boston. He decided that the Monroe Doctrine, the 1823 policy that essentially told Europe, stay on your side of the ocean and we won't have to have a conversation involving gunpowder, needed a modern update. On December 6, 1904, in his annual message to Congress, TR added what historians call the Roosevelt Corollary. In the grand catalogue of diplomatic literature, this was the equivalent of a P.S. at the bottom of a century-old letter that said, "By the way, not only are you not allowed in the yard, but if the neighbors make too much noise, I'm the one who's going to go over there and punch them." The neighborhood watch with a gunboat. To understand the corollary, you have to understand the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, James Monroe had put up a "No Trespassing" sign on the Western Hemisphere. It was a bold move for a young nation that barely had a navy, but it worked mostly because the British happened to agree with it. By 1904, however, the neighbors, specifically the nations of the Caribbean and Central America, were having some financial trouble. They owed a great deal of money to European banks. When they couldn't pay, the Europeans did what any reasonable 19th century empire would do. They sent warships to hang around the harbors and look menacing until someone produced a bag of gold. Roosevelt saw a problem. If the Europeans sent ships to collect debts, they might decide to stay for the scenery. But if the Americans told the Europeans to go home, the debts would never get paid, and the financial system would collapse. TR's solution was a masterpiece of big stick logic. The United States would act as the international police power. If a Latin American country engaged in chronic wrongdoing, or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society, the U.S. would step in, take over the custom houses, collect the taxes, pay the European debts, and then hand the country back, after keeping a small service fee for the trouble, of course. Twain's rule of debt collection: if you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. If you owe a European emperor $100 million, that's Uncle Sam's opportunity to move into your guest room. The Dominican Republic, the first customer. The first practical application of this new badge happened in the Dominican Republic. By 1904, the country was essentially bankrupt and owed millions to Italy, France, and Germany. The European powers were polishing their cannons and checking their maps. Roosevelt didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped in and declared that the U.S. would manage the Dominican Republic's finances. He sent in American officials to count every penny that came through the ports. It was the geopolitical equivalent of your older brother taking away your wallet because you spent too much money on magic tricks and expecting you to thank him for the stability. The Europeans were satisfied because they got their money. The Americans were satisfied because the Europeans went home. The Dominicans were, well, they were largely ignored, which was the standard treatment for any nation smaller than a Texas ranch in 1904. The big stick philosophy, a weaponized whisper. This was the year that the phrase, "speak softly and carry a big stick," became more than just a quote in a letter to a friend. It became the official operating manual of the American government. Roosevelt's big stick was not a metaphor. It was the U.S. Navy. He had spent the last few years building a fleet of steel battleships that were painted white, not for camouflage, but because he wanted them to be visible from space. He wanted the world to know that while he might be speaking softly, a claim that anyone who ever heard T.R. shout would find dubious, there were several thousand tons of armor-plated persuasion floating just over the horizon. The old way, Monroe. The new way, Roosevelt. Europe, stay out. Europe, stay out, because we will handle the beating. Defensive and reactive, offensive and preventative. Mind your own business. Your business is our business if you mess it up. Passive observation, active police power. The international police power and the loss of innocence. The Roosevelt corollary marked the moment the United States officially outgrew its republic phase and entered its precinct phase. We were no longer just a nation among nations. We were the self-appointed bouncer of the Western Hemisphere. To Roosevelt, this was a bully idea. He genuinely believed that the U.S. had a moral obligation to civilize its neighbors. He viewed international relations through the lens of a Victorian morality play. There were civilized nations who had factories, navies, and starched collars, and uncivilized nations who had debts, revolutions, and a distressing lack of coal. However, many in the U.S. and abroad were less than thrilled. Critics argued that the U.S. was becoming the very thing it had fought against in 1776, an overseas empire with a habit of telling other people how to run their own houses. But T.R. didn't care about critics. He was too busy looking at the map of the world and wondering which other neighbors might need a visit from the constable. The legacy of the P.S. The Roosevelt corollary would dominate American foreign policy for the next 30 years. It would lead to banana wars, occupations of Haiti and Nicaragua, and a general sense in Latin America that Uncle Sam was a very helpful friend who had a distressing habit of never leaving your living room. It turned the Caribbean into an American lake. It ensured that the Panama Canal would be protected by a ring of steel and debt management programs. And it solidified the image of the American president as a man who didn't just sign laws, but enforce them with a fleet of battleships and a very loud set of teeth. A satirical inventory of the badge. The stick, the Great White Fleet, 14,000 tons of please behave. The soft speech, a series of diplomatic cables that were about as soft as a brick through a window. The target, any nation with a balance sheet that didn't add up and a harbor that looked inviting. The winner, American banks and the U.S. Navy's budget. The loser, the concept of sovereignty for anyone living south of the Rio Grande. By December 1904, the U.S. had successfully declared itself the manager of the neighborhood. We had the canal, we had the perfect game, and now we had the badge. We were the international police power, and we were ready to settle any dispute, provided we got to keep the gate receipts. But as Teddy Roosevelt finished his speech to Congress and went home to play with his 6 children and his collection of bearskins, he had one more task to complete in 1904. He had to win an election, and he had to do it in a way that would make his previous landslide look like a tie. Chapter 15, TR's Landslide, the Accidental President, and the Fatal Promise. By the autumn of 1904, Theodore Roosevelt was suffering from a very specific and very loud form of anxiety. Despite having governed the United States for 3 years with the energy of a landslide and the subtlety of a brass band, he still felt like a squatter in the White House. He had inherited the job in 1901 after an anarchist decided that William McKinley's presidency was entirely too stable, and ever since, the old guard of the Republican Party had treated Roosevelt like a wild grizzly bear they had accidentally invited to a tea party. They were hoping he'd eventually get bored and wander back to the woods. Roosevelt, however, was currently busy rearranging the furniture and demanding more tea. To TR, the election of 1904 was more than a political contest. It was a psychological necessity. He didn't just want to win, he wanted a mandate. He wanted the American people to look at his big stick, his loud teeth, and his habit of punching monopolies and say, yes, this is exactly the kind of madness we want for another 4 years. He wanted to prove he wasn't just an accident of history, but its primary destination. The opponent, Alton B. Parker, the human sedative. In a year defined by the World's Fair and the birth of the Waffle Cone, the Democratic Party decided that their best strategy for victory was to nominate a man who was the political equivalent of a lukewarm glass of water. Alton B. Parker was a chief judge of the New York Court of Appeals. He was a man of impeccable dignity, magnificent silence, and a total absence of whatever it was that made people want to cheer. Parker's campaign strategy was what historians call the front porch campaign, which essentially meant he sat on his porch in Esopus, New York, and waited for the presidency to realize its mistake and come to him. While Roosevelt was out west, literally wrestling with the landscape and shouting about the strenuous life, Parker was busy issuing occasional, carefully worded statements about the gold standard that was so boring they could turn a riot into a nap. The Democrats hoped that after 3 years of TR's bully enthusiasm, the American public would be exhausted and would crave the sweet, sweet embrace of a man who did absolutely nothing. They were wrong. In 1904, Americans didn't want a nap. They wanted a show. The square deal, a hand of cards for the common man. Roosevelt's campaign was built on a single catchy phrase, the square deal. In the grand tradition of American political slogans, it was vague enough to sound like a promise, but specific enough to sound like a threat to the right people. Roosevelt declared that he didn't favor the rich and he didn't favor the poor. He just wanted everyone to have a square deal. The same way a gambler wants a deck of cards that hasn't been marked by the house. To the trusts, the massive monopolies that owned everything from oil to birdseed, the square deal meant Roosevelt was going to keep his big stick polished and ready for action. To the labor unions, it meant that for the first time in history, the president might not automatically send the army to shoot them during a strike. TR was the first president to realize that if you could convince both the coal miner and the shopkeeper that you were on their side, you didn't actually need the support of the billionaires. Twain's observation on political fairness, a square deal, is a magnificent concept, provided the man dealing the cards is the one who also owns the table, the chairs, and the building they're sitting in. Roosevelt was the dealer, and he had a very firm grip on the deck. The campaign of no campaigning. In 1904, it was considered undignified for a sitting president to go out and actively ask for votes. Roosevelt, a man who found dignity to be a very restrictive garment, tried his best to follow the rule. But he was like a steam engine trying to pretend it was a bicycle. He spent the summer vacationing at Sagamore Hill, which mostly involved him inviting every journalist in the country to watch him chop down trees, jump over fences, and talk at 300 words per minute about the glory of the American spirit. The Republicans spent a record-breaking amount of money on the campaign, much of it donated by the very same trusts Roosevelt was busy busting. It was a beautiful piece of 1904 irony. The billionaires were paying for the privilege of being punched in the face. They figured that Roosevelt was a madman, but at least he was a madman they knew. Parker was a mystery wrapped in a judicial robe, and in business, a known lunatic is always better than an unknown judge. Election night, the landslide, and the blunder. On November 8, 1904, the American public spoke, and they spoke with a roar that could be heard from the St. Louis Fairgrounds to the tip of Manhattan. Roosevelt didn't just win, he obliterated Parker. He won every single state outside of the solid South. He took 56% of the popular vote, the largest margin since the era of good feelings. Parker didn't even win his home state of New York. The country had officially signed off on the Big Stick, the Panama Canal, and the general idea that America should be the loud, muscular teenager of the international community. But it was in the middle of this triumph that Roosevelt made the greatest mistake of his political life. On the night of his victory, overwhelmed by the mandate, and perhaps a bit lightheaded from the sheer volume of his own success, he issued a statement to the press. On the 4th of March next, I shall have served 3.5 years, and this 3.5 years constitutes my first term. The wise custom which limits the president to 2 terms regards the substance and not the form, and under no circumstances will I be a candidate for or accept another nomination. In that moment, Roosevelt became a lame duck 4 years before he had to. He had just won the greatest mandate in history, and his first act was to tell the world he was quitting. His wife, Edith, reportedly looked at him with the expression of a woman who had just watched her husband throw his car keys into a lake. She knew that TR loved the presidency more than he loved oxygen, and he had just promised to stop breathing in 1909. A satirical inventory of the landslide. The winner, Theodore Roosevelt. Mandate, massive. Teeth, polished. Ego, infinite. The loser, Alton B. Parker. Status, still on his porch. Impact, roughly equal to a polite cough in a hurricane. The slogan, the square deal. A promise that everyone gets a fair shake, provided TR is the one shaking. The fatal error, the no third term pledge, a gift to every one of TR's enemies, delivered with a bow and a smile. The voters' verdict: we don't know where he's going, but we like the way he looks while he's getting there. By the end of 1904, Teddy Roosevelt was the undisputed king of America. He had the badge, he had the canal, and now he had the official permission of the people to be as vigorous as he wanted. He was at the absolute peak of his powers, blissfully unaware that he had just started the countdown to his own retirement. But while the president was celebrating his landslide, the city of New York was still reeling from a tragedy that reminded everyone that progress had a very dark shadow. While the 20th century was about speed and light, it was still being built on the bones of the 19th. The General Slocum, a reminder of fragility. In the next chapter, we look at the General Slocum disaster, a reminder that while we were busy building empires and winning landslides, we had forgotten to check if our life jackets were actually made of life-saving material or if they were just bags of rotten cork and lead weights. It was the day New York City learned that modernity could be just as cruel as the primitive past. Chapter 16. The General Slocum Disaster. The Rotten Cork of Progress. While the rest of 1904 was busy polishing its metals and inventing new ways to eat sugar while walking, the city of New York was about to receive a cold, wet slap in the face from the 19th century. We have spent much of this chronicle marveling at the Ivory City in St. Louis and the silver silence of the Rolls-Royce. But we must remember that progress is often just a fresh coat of paint applied to a pile of dry rot. On June 15, 1904, the citizens of Little Germany, Klein Deutschland, on the Lower East Side, decided to take a day off from being industrious and soot-covered. They boarded a side-wheel steamboat named the General Slocum for a Sunday school picnic. It was supposed to be a day of beer, bratwurst, and the gentle lapping of the East River. Instead, it became a reminder that while humanity was busy dreaming of the future, it had neglected to check the expiration date on its life jackets. The excursion steamer, a floating tinderbox. The General Slocum was a magnificent specimen of American naval engineering, provided your definition of engineering involves a high-speed collision between a lumberyard and a kerosene lamp. She was a white-painted beauty, a triple-decker palace of wood and canvas that had spent 13 years ferrying New Yorkers to picnic grounds. In 1904, the excursion steamer was the ultimate escape for the working class. For a few cents, you could leave the tenements behind and breathe air that didn't smell like a horse's bad decisions. The passengers of the Slocum were mostly women and children, mothers in their finest Sunday lace, and kids clutching wooden toys, all belonging to St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church. They were the backbone of the city, the kind of people who believed that if a man in a uniform told you a boat was safe, he was probably telling the truth. Twain's note on trust. There is no creature more dangerous to itself than a civilized human being who believes the government has inspected the equipment. A wild animal knows the branch might break. A New Yorker assumes the branch has been certified by a committee. The inspection, a masterclass in apathy. Just weeks before the disaster, the General Slocum had been inspected by the local authorities. The inspector, a man whose primary qualification for the job was likely his ability to find a tavern in a fog, had given the ship a clean bill of health. He looked at the fire hoses and declared them sturdy, despite the fact that they were so rotten they would have crumbled if you'd sneezed on them. He looked at the lifeboats and noted they were present, ignoring the fact they were wired and painted into their cradles so securely that it would have taken a team of archaeologists and a blowtorch to remove them. But the real achievement of 1904 safety standards was the life jacket. The Slocum carried thousands of life jackets. They had been a-sitting on the overhead racks since the ship was built in 1891. Over 13 years, the cork inside had turned into fine, dry dust. To make matters worse, the manufacturer, a firm that clearly viewed human life as a secondary line item on their balance sheet, had discovered that their life jackets were coming in under the legal weight requirement. Their solution? They inserted iron weights into the cork to make them legal. It was a masterpiece of corporate efficiency. They had created a life-saving device that was specifically designed to help you reach the bottom of the river faster. The spark and the fan. The fire started in the lamp room, a small cabin filled with oil-soaked rags and straw. Essentially, a room designed by an arsonist with a grudge. When a spark hit the rags, the room went up like a Roman candle. Had this happened on land, someone would have grabbed a bucket. But on the General Slocum, everything that could go wrong did so with a rhythmic, tragic precision. The crew, mostly teenagers who had been hired for their ability to look good in a sailor hat, rather than their knowledge of firefighting, tried to use the hoses. The moment the water pressure hit the linen, the hoses burst into 1,000 pieces. They were essentially trying to put out a bonfire with a collection of wet noodles. Then there was Captain William Van Schaik. Van Schaik was a veteran of the river, a man who had survived 1,000 trips. But when the fire broke out, he made a decision that will be debated as long as there are boats. Instead of grounding the ship immediately on the nearby shore, he decided to keep up full speed, heading toward North Brother Island. He thought he was being strategic. In reality, he was acting as a giant bellows. The wind from the ship's movement fanned the flames, turning the wooden decks into a horizontal chimney. Within minutes, the General Slocum was a floating torch, screaming through the East River at 15 knots. The choice, the fire or the lead. For the mothers on board, the situation was a nightmare of physics. If they stayed on the deck, they were burned. If they jumped into the water, they had to rely on the life jackets. Mothers strapped the vests onto their children and tossed them overboard, only to watch in horror as the safety devices did exactly what the iron weights intended. The children sank instantly. The cork dust inside the vests absorbed water, turning the jackets into heavy, sodden anchors. Those who tried to lower the lifeboats found them immobile, painted into the very fabric of the ship as a decorative afterthought. By the time the ship ran aground at North Brother Island, over 1,000 people were dead. It was the largest loss of life in New York City history, a record that would stand until September 11, 2001. The aftermath. Little Germany vanishes. The General Slocum disaster didn't just kill people, it killed a neighborhood. Little Germany was a tight-knit community that had centered itself around the church. When nearly every family in the district lost a mother, a child, or both, the heart of the community simply stopped beating. Within a few years, the German population fled the Lower East Side, moving north to Yorkville or out to the boroughs, leaving behind empty tenements and a trauma that a century couldn't wash away. And what of the progress that 1904 was so proud of? The legal fallout was a classic display of Edwardian justice. The directors of the Knickerbocker Steamboat Company, the men who had authorized the rotten hoses and the weighted life jackets, were never punished. They expressed their deepest sympathies and went back to their mansions. The only person to serve time was Captain Van Schack. He was sent to Sing Sing for 10 years, a 70-year-old scapegoat for a system that was built on a foundation of good enough. A satirical inventory of the tragedy. The inspection, a 10-minute walkthrough by a man who couldn't tell the difference between a fire hose and a garden snake. The life jackets, 10% cork dust, 20% rotten canvas, and 70% corporate greed, with iron weights for buoyancy. The captain's strategy: if the fire is hot, move faster to give it more oxygen. The corporate response: a very expensive set of lawyers and a profound sense of "it's not our fault." The lesson: the 20th century may have electricity and waffle cones, but it's still being steered by 19th century scoundrels. The General Slocum was the Titanic of the East River, a reminder that the Gilded Age was only gilded on the surface. Beneath the gold leaf was the same old rust and the same old indifference to the lives of those who didn't own the boat. But as the city mourned, the wheels of science were still turning. We were about to find a way to bottle the very ghost of progress itself. If we couldn't make a life jacket that floated, perhaps we could at least make a glass tube that could catch a voice from across the ocean. Section 6. Science and Literature. Chapter 17. The Fleming Valve, the Bottled Ghost of Connectivity. By late 1904, the human race had become remarkably adept at moving things that were heavy. We had moved mountains in Panama, moved millions of gallons of water in the East River, mostly into the lungs of people we should have been protecting, and moved wooden balls across baseball diamonds with the precision of a Swiss watch. But the 20th century was growing bored with the physical. It was tired of the clang and thud of progress. It was looking for something more subtle, something more spectral. It was looking for a way to move the invisible. Enter John Ambrose Fleming, an Englishman who looked exactly like what you'd expect a 1904 scientist to look like. A man whose beard was a triumph of geometry and whose collar was so high he could only see the future by tilting his entire head back. In November of 1904, Fleming performed a bit of electrical sorcery that would eventually lead to the invention of radio, television, and the modern ability to be insulted by a complete stranger from 3,000 miles away while you are sitting in your pajamas. He invented the thermionic valve, better known as the vacuum tube. It was the bottled ghost of the new century, and it proved that the most important thing you could build was a glass container full of absolutely nothing. The Edison effect and the jumping fleas. To understand the Fleming valve, we must first look back at Thomas Edison, a man who patented everything from the light bulb to the concept of the afternoon nap. In the 1880s, Edison noticed that inside his glowing glass bulbs, a strange black soot would build up on the glass. More interestingly, he noticed that electricity seemed to be jumping across the empty space inside the bulb, moving from the hot filament to a metal plate like a group of caffeinated fleas trying to escape a burning rug. Edison, being a man of practical commerce, saw no immediate way to sell this phenomenon to a housewife in Ohio, so he wrote it down as the Edison effect and moved on to more profitable things like trying to execute elephants with alternating current. But John Ambrose Fleming was not a man of commerce. He was a man of radio. He was working as a consultant for Guglielmo Marconi, the Italian wizard who had spent the last few years proving that you could send a beep across the Atlantic if you had a large enough antenna and a sufficient disregard for the sanity of the neighbors. The problem was that the beep arrived weak, garbled, and confused. It needed to be caught, straightened out, and yelled back into existence. The valve, plumbing, for the invisible. Fleming's genius was to realize that Edison's jumping fleas, which we now call electrons, though jumping fleas has more character, only jumped in one direction, from the hot wire to the cold plate. They refused to go back. He created a device with two elements inside a vacuum, a cathode, the hot, angry wire, and an anode, the cool, receptive plate. Because the electricity could only flow one way, he called it a valve. Now, the Americans, being a people who prefer the literal to the metaphorical, eventually called it a tube, because it looked like a tube. But the British valve is the superior term, because it perfectly describes what was happening. Fleming had invented the plumbing of the 20th century. He had created a faucet that could turn the chaotic, oscillating waves of the atmosphere into a steady, one-way stream of information. Twain's observation on nothingness: there is a profound irony in the fact that the foundation of the modern world is the vacuum. We spent thousands of years trying to fill the world with stuff, only to discover that the most powerful tool we ever made was a glass bottle from which we had carefully removed every single molecule of air. It turns out that progress doesn't need air. It just needs a clear path to jump across. The death of silence and the birth of the unseen annoyance. Before 1904, if you wanted to be annoyed by someone, they had to be in the same room as you, or at the very least, they had to send you a letter that took 3 days to arrive. You had time to prepare your indignation. You could see the annoyance coming down the driveway. The Fleming valve changed the social contract of the planet. By allowing for the amplification and rectification of radio signals, it set the stage for the radio. Suddenly, a man in a shed in London could project his voice into a parlor in Kansas. It meant that for the first time in history, you could be bored, lectured, or sung to by someone you couldn't see, and whom you couldn't hit with a broom. It was the birth of mass connectivity, which is a polite way of saying the end of peace and quiet. It led directly to the news, the ability to hear about a disaster in a country you can't spell before you've even finished your breakfast. The commercial, the ability for a man with a baritone voice to convince you that your life is incomplete without a specific brand of shoe polish. The computer, eventually, these tubes would shrink and multiply until they became the brains of machines that could calculate the trajectory of a moon rocket, or more importantly, a cat video. the 1904 laboratory versus the 20th century living room. In 1904, the Fleming valve was a fragile, glowing curiosity that lived on a laboratory bench and smelled of ozone and hot glass. If you showed it to the average fairgoer in St. Louis, they would have asked where the crank was and if it could make their laundry dry faster. But Fleming knew that he had captured a ghost in a bottle. He had found a way to take the wireless beeps of Marconi and turn them into something human. He had provided the nerve endings for the global nervous system. We were moving away from the era of mechanical brute force, the steam shovel, the locomotive, the cannon, and into the era of electronic finesse. We were learning that you didn't always need a 95-ton Bucyrus shovel to change the world. Sometimes you just needed a very small piece of wire and a very empty glass tube. A satirical inventory of the vacuum. The contents: absolutely nothing. The highest quality nothing available in 1904. The function: allowing electrons to jump from A to B without the awkwardness of them trying to return to A. The future implications: jazz, propaganda, weather reports, and the eventual development of the Internet, where the jumping fleas now carry the collective rage of the species. The winner: John Ambrose Fleming, and eventually anyone who ever wanted to hear music without having to invite a tuba player into their house. The loser: the concept of solitude and the 19th century belief that if I can't see it, it can't bother me. As the glow of the first thermionic valves flickered in a lab in London, the year 1904 was drawing to a close. We had the physical world handled. The dirt was moving, the cars were quiet, and the hamburgers were greasy. Now we had the invisible world handled too. We had found a way to bottle the airless void and make it talk. But while the scientists were playing with glass ghosts, the writers were busy documenting the more muscular, visceral side of the human experience. While Fleming was looking at a vacuum, Jack London was looking at the sea and the wolf within the man. Chapter 18. Jack London and the Sea Wolf. Literature gets a hair on its chest. While the scientists like John Ambrose Fleming were busy in their laboratories bottling the invisible ghosts of the vacuum, the literary world of 1904 was undergoing a transformation that was considerably more moist and saltier, and significantly more likely to punch you in the jaw if you didn't pay attention. For the better part of the 19th century, the English-speaking world had been fed a steady diet of sentimental realism. This was a genre where the greatest tragedy was a misplaced tea invitation, and the hero's primary struggle was deciding which waistcoat best conveyed his internal melancholy. But as the 20th century roared into life, the public began to grow tired of polite misunderstandings in parlors. They wanted grit. They wanted the spray of the ocean. They wanted to be reminded that despite our starched collars and our 5-cent subway rides, we were still essentially clever apes with a penchant for trouble. Enter Jack London. In 1904, London published The Sea Wolf, a novel that didn't just enter the literary scene. It kicked the door down, spit on the rug, and demanded to know why everyone was sitting around drinking decaffeinated tea. It was the birth of muscular literature, a movement that reminded the world that nature was not a manicured garden for poets to weep in, but a cold, indifferent machine that was red in tooth and claw. The man who was his own protagonist. To understand the Sea Wolf, you must first understand Jack London. In 1904, London was the closest thing the world had to a literary superstar who could also probably out-wrestle a grizzly bear. He was a man who lived his life as if he were trying to win a bet against his own mortality. He had been an oyster pirate, a hobo, a gold prospector in the Klondike, and a war correspondent. While other writers were sitting in comfortable chairs dreaming of adventure, London was out there having it, and contracting scurvy in the process. He didn't just write about the struggle for survival. He had lived it on a diet of shoe leather and frozen beans. By the time he sat down to write about Wolf Larsen, he was less of a man of letters and more of a man of bruises. Twain's rule of authorship. There are two types of writers, those who imagine the storm from the safety of their study, and those who describe the storm while currently clinging to a mast. Jack London was the latter, which is why his prose smells like salt and desperation, whereas most Victorian novels smell like old lavender and repressed desires. Wolf Larsen, the Nietzschean Superman with a harpoon. The star of 1904's literary season was undoubtedly Wolf Larsen, the captain of the seal-hunting schooner Ghost. Larsen remains one of the most terrifying characters in fiction because he isn't just a villain, he's an intellectual brute. He is a man who can break a sailor's ribs with one hand while quoting Omar Khayyam with the other. The plot of The Sea Wolf is a classic 1904 clash of civilizations. It begins with Humphrey Van Weyden, a refined, soft literary critic, a man who probably spent his mornings debating the finer points of sonnets, being rescued from a shipwreck by Larsen. However, rescue is a generous term. Larsen doesn't return Humphrey to his comfortable life in San Francisco. He presses him into service as a cabin boy. It is the ultimate nerd versus bully story, but on a boat filled with knives and zero witnesses. Larsen views Humphrey, whom he nicknames Hump, as a useless piece of yeast. In Larsen's worldview, a dark, distilled version of social Darwinism, life is nothing more than a biological accident that is constantly trying to eat other biological accidents. The philosophy of the yeast. In The Sea Wolf, London used Larsen to voice the naturalist philosophy that was gripping the early 20th century. Larsen famously describes life as follows: "I believe that life is a mess. It is like a yeast, a ferment, a thing that moves and may move for a minute, an hour, a day, or a year, but that eventually will cease to move. The big eat the little that they may continue to move. The strong eat the weak that they may retain their strength. The lucky eat the most and move the longest. That is all." This was the anti-Waffle Cone philosophy. While the World's Fair was celebrating the brotherhood of man and the progress of the species, Jack London was reminding everyone that if you strip away the electricity and the brass bands, we are all just yeast trying not to be eaten by the bigger yeast. It was a perfect mirror for the year 1904. It reflected the Russo-Japanese War, the big empire being surprised by the stronger upstart, the Panama Canal, humanity beating the jungle into submission, and the trust-busting of Teddy Roosevelt, the government trying to prove it was the biggest wolf in the pack. The muscular prose. London's writing style was as aggressive as his characters. He threw away the flowery adjectives of the previous generation and replaced them with verbs that felt like they were being delivered via a steam shovel. He wrote with a primitive energy that appealed to the 1904 reader, a reader who was currently living through a time of massive, terrifying change, and who found comfort in the idea that strength and will were the only things that truly mattered. This was naturalism. It was the literary equivalent of the St. Louis Marathon, a grueling, dusty, chemical-fueled race where the weak died and the strong, or the ones who took enough strychnine, survived. London didn't offer a happy ending where everyone went home for tea. He offered a survival of the fittest that left the reader feeling both exhausted and strangely exhilarated. The wolf versus the gentleman. The tension of the novel lies in Humphrey's transformation. By the end of the book, the soft literary critic has learned to cook, to sail, to fight, and to survive. He has gained muscularity. This was the great obsession of the Edwardian male, the fear that civilization, with its subways and its iced tea, was making men soft. Teddy Roosevelt, the kernel of the strenuous life, was the patron saint of this anxiety. Jack London was its poet laureate. They both believed that if a man didn't occasionally go out and punch the wilderness, his soul would eventually turn into a puddle of warm custard. A satirical inventory of the muscular novel. The hero, Humphrey Van Weyden, starts as a hump, ends as a he-man. The anti-hero, Wolf Larsen, a man who is 50% muscle, 50% nihilism, and 0% fun at parties. The setting, the Ghost, a floating laboratory designed to prove that the ocean doesn't care about your feelings. The primary ingredient, salt water, seal blood, and a total lack of mercy. The lesson, you might be a genius who can recite the classics, but that won't help you when the yeast decides it's lunchtime. As the readers of 1904 turned the final pages of The Sea Wolf, they were left with a profound sense of unease. They looked at their quiet Rolls-Royces and their gleaming palaces of plaster and wondered if the wolf was still lurking somewhere inside them. Jack London had successfully reminded the 20th century that progress is just a thin layer of ice over a very deep, very cold, and very hungry ocean. But while the wolf was dominating the bestseller lists in America, the great bear of the North was currently engaged in a physical manifestation of Larsen's philosophy. Russia was trying to prove its strength by completing a ribbon of steel across the largest frozen wasteland on Earth. They were finishing the Trans-Siberian Railway, and they were doing it just in time to watch everything they owned fall apart. Chapter 19. The Trans-Siberian Railway is finished, a one-way ticket to a cold reality. While the Americans were cutting a hole through Panama and the British were bottling nothing in vacuum tubes, the Russian Empire was busy putting the finishing touches on the world's most expensive and extensive ribbon of iron, the Trans-Siberian Railway. In July 1904, after 13 years of labor, millions of rubles, and enough timber to rebuild the Garden of Eden several times over, the Tsar proudly announced that his great railroad was finally finished. I use the term finished in the Russian sense of the word, which usually translates to, it exists, but please don't look too closely at the gaps, and for the love of the saints, don't try to pass another train on the same track. The Trans-Siberian was a monument to the Russian imperial ego, a 5,700-mile-long declaration that the Tsar could conquer geography itself. It was intended to connect the gold-leafed ballrooms of St. Petersburg to the muddy, torpedo-threatened harbors of the Pacific. It was a magnificent achievement of 19th-century ambition that arrived just in time to participate in 20th-century failure. The imperial scale of stupidity. To understand the Trans-Siberian, you have to understand the sheer terrifying size of Russia. Russia is not a country. It is a geographic hallucination. It covers 11 time zones, which means that when a man in Moscow is having his morning tea, a man in Vladivostok is watching the sun go down and wondering where his morning tea went. Before the railway, moving across the empire was a process that required a sturdy carriage, a high tolerance for frostbite, and the patience of a stone. The Tsar, Alexander III, decided that the only way to keep his sprawling house in order was to nail it down with steel. He wanted to move soldiers, peasants, and influence from west to east with the same mechanical ease as a man moving a chess piece across a board. Construction began in 1891, with the future Tsar Nicholas II personally tipping the first wheelbarrow of dirt. For the next decade, the Russian government threw everything it had into the void: steel from the Urals, timber from the taiga, and a labor force composed of soldiers, peasants, and convicts who were told that digging a ditch in Siberia was a spiritual opportunity to redeem their souls through sweat. The Lake Baikal bottleneck. By 1904, the track was almost complete, save for one minor shimmering detail: Lake Baikal. Lake Baikal is the deepest, oldest, and most stubborn body of water on the planet. It is surrounded by granite mountains that look like they were designed by an architect who hated railroads. In 1904, the Russians hadn't yet finished the difficult Circum-Baikal section, the part where the tracks were supposed to go around the lake through dozens of tunnels and over hundreds of bridges. So, in true 1904 fashion, they decided to ignore the land and focus on the water. They ordered two massive ice-breaking ferries from England, the Baikal and the Angara. The idea was that the train would roll onto the boat, sail across the lake, and roll off the other side. This was a lovely plan in the summer. However, in a Siberian winter, Lake Baikal freezes into a sheet of ice thick enough to support the weight of a guilty conscience. When the Russo-Japanese War broke out and the military desperately needed to move reinforcements to the front, the ferries got stuck in the ice. The Russians, refusing to let physics get in the way of a bad idea, decided to lay tracks directly on the ice. They hitched teams of horses to the train cars and dragged them across the frozen lake. It was a scene of pure, frozen slapstick. When they tried to use a locomotive, the ice, displaying a sudden and inconvenient commitment to its own liquid nature, cracked under the weight. A massive engine plunged through the ice and into the abyss, where it presumably remains to this day, providing a very confusing landmark for the local sturgeon: the single-track trap. The greatest flaw of the Trans-Siberian in 1904 was its singularity. Most of the line was a single track. In the world of railroads, a single track is a recipe for a logistical aneurysm. If you have a train of soldiers going east and a train of wounded men or empty coal cars going west, they eventually meet in the middle of a 500-mile forest. Since trains cannot leapfrog one another, one of them has to back up for several miles to a siding, a small bit of double track, to let the other pass. During the war, this meant that the Russian military logistics were moving at the pace of a very tired snail. It took 4 weeks for a soldier to get from Moscow to Manchuria. By the time he arrived, he was malnourished, bored, and his uniform was 3 fashions out of date. Meanwhile, the Japanese, who only had to sail across a relatively small pond, were already there, dug in, and wondering what was taking the Russians so long. Luxury versus lethality. The Trans-Siberian was a study in Russian inequality. For the wealthy traveler and the high-ranking officer, the train was a palace on wheels. It featured mahogany paneling, velvet curtains, a piano in the dining car, and a library. There was even a church car for those who felt the need to pray for the strength of the axle. For the common soldier, the experience was slightly different. They were packed 40 to a car into wooden boxes that were officially labeled as cattle cars, though the cattle likely would have filed a complaint with the union. They spent weeks huddled together, eating hardtack, and dreaming of the day they could finally get off the train and be shot at by the Japanese. Twayton's rule of imperial transport: if the general has a piano and the private has a flea, the war is already over. It's just a matter of waiting for the music to stop. The final verdict of the Iron Ribbon. By the end of 1904, the Trans-Siberian Railway had been officially completed, with the opening of the Circumbaikal line in October. The Tsar celebrated. The newspapers in St. Petersburg called it the spine of the empire. But a spine is only useful if it's attached to a body that knows where it's going. The railway succeeded in moving thousands of men to their doom, but it failed to move the one thing Russia actually needed: efficiency. It was a 19th century solution to a 20th century problem. It proved that you can span a continent with steel, but you cannot span the gap between a medieval government and a modern war. A satirical inventory of the railway. Total length, 5,772 miles, enough to encircle the moon, which would have been equally useful. Primary fuel, soft coal, wood, and the tears of the proletariat. The Lake Baikal shortcut. A watery grave for at least one locomotive and several thousand horses' dignity. The speed, approximately 15 miles per hour, fast enough to feel progress, slow enough to grow a beard. The winner, the Japanese Navy, who knew exactly where the Russians were coming from. The loser, the Russian treasury, and the concept of getting there on time. As the last golden spikes were driven into the frozen earth of the Far East, the year 1904 was almost at an end. The Trans-Siberian was a grand, beautiful, and utterly doomed masterpiece. It was a metaphor for the Russian Empire itself, vast, impressive, and currently hurtling toward a cliff at 15 miles per hour. But as the trains rattled across the Siberian wasteland, the rest of the world was turning its eyes back to the St. Louis fairgrounds. The lights were being turned off, the plaster was starting to peel, and a small frizzy-haired clerk in Switzerland was starting to think that perhaps time and space weren't as solid as a Russian rail. Section 7. The Final Verdict. Chapter 20. 1905 is peeking over the horizon, melting cones and merging dimensions. By December 1904, the world was suffering from a collective case of exhaustion. It had been a year of relentless motion. We had dug holes, fought wars, eaten while walking, and breathed enough iron dust in the New York subway to render ourselves magnetic. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition was finally drawing to a close, and as the winter winds began to whip across the Mississippi, the shimmering Ivory City was starting to look less like a monument to progress and more like a soggy cake that had been left out in the rain. The problem with building a civilization out of staff, that mixture of plaster and hemp, is that it is essentially a fair-weather philosophy. As the temperatures dropped, the grand neoclassical columns began to crack, and the majestic statues of progress began to lose their ears. It was a sobering metaphor for the year itself, a magnificent, sprawling, loud, and slightly fraudulent spectacle that was currently being scheduled for demolition. The Great Demolition, tearing down the dream. On December 1st, 1904, the gates of the World's Fair swung shut for the last time. Almost immediately, the City of Light was invaded by an army of men with sledgehammers. It is one of the strangest quirks of 1904 that we spent $15 million to build a dream, only to spend another few million to turn it back into a pile of rubble and a public park. The Palace of Electricity was dismantled. The giant floral clock was dug up. Even the Ferris wheel, which had survived 2 World's Fairs and several thousand bouts of motion sickness, was eventually destined for the scrap heap. We were clearing the stage. The 19th century habit of building things to last for 1,000 years was officially dead. 1904 taught us that the future is something you rent for 6 months, enjoy with a waffle cone, and then bulldoze to make room for the next model. The patent clerk in the shadows. While the world was busy tearing down plaster palaces in Missouri, a 25-year-old patent clerk in Bern, Switzerland, was busy tearing down the very foundation of reality. His name was Albert Einstein, and in late 1904, he was working a day job that involved checking other people's inventions for technical flaws. In his spare time, however, he was engaged in the most dangerous hobby in history. He was thinking about light. Einstein looked at the world of 1904, a world obsessed with the mechanical, steam shovels, railroads, gears, and realized that we were all missing the point. We believed that time was a constant, like a giant cosmic metronome, and that space was a fixed stage. Einstein was starting to suspect that time and space were actually more like the staff of the World's Fair, flexible, relative, and prone to bending depending on how fast you were moving. By the time 1905 arrived, Einstein's Annus Mirabilis, miracle year, he would release the papers that gave us the most famous equation in history, E equals mc squared. In 1904, this was still a whisper in his mind. He was realizing that energy and mass were just 2 different outfits worn by the same physical entity. It was the ultimate change of pace. While we were worried about how many calories it took to walk through a fair, Einstein was realizing that a single gram of a hamburger contained enough energy to power the entire city of St. Louis, provided you knew how to unbottle the ghost. A satirical inventory, the 1904 carryover. As we prepare to hand the keys of the world over to 1905, let us take one final inventory of what 1904 is leaving behind in our luggage. Item, status, 20th century impact, the waffle cone, melting, the birth of the on-the-go lifestyle and permanent necktie stains, the iced tea, chilled, $1 billion industry, and the realization that Americans love ice more than life itself. The subway. Dirty. The democratization of speed and the death of fresh air. The big stick. Polished. The U.S. as the neighborhood cop. A badge that would never be returned. The vacuum tube. Glowing. The death of silence and the birth of the bottled ghost of radio. The Panama Canal. Muddy. Geography rewritten to save 3 weeks of sailing and a lot of coal. The verdict. The birth of the messy century. 1904 was the year humanity perfected the art of the system. We learned that you could manage a war, a railroad, a canal, or a diet, provided you had enough bureaucracy and a loud enough leader. We moved away from the individual achievement of the 1800s and into the industrial process of the 1900s. But it was also a year of profound contradictions. We were more civilized than ever, yet we were using rat poison as a sports drink. We were more connected than ever, yet we were using that connectivity to coordinate the sinking of fleets. We had built a city of light, while 1,000 people were drowning in the East River because of rotten cork. Twain's final word. 1904 was a magnificent, greasy, loud, and brilliant rehearsal. We learned how to move fast, but we hadn't yet learned where we were going. We had the tools of gods and the appetites of children. We were standing on the edge of a new world, holding a hamburger and a vacuum tube, waiting for the clock to strike midnight. 1905, peeking over the horizon. As the snow covers the ruins of the St. Louis Fair, the world turns toward 1905. In Russia, the Great Bear is about to face a revolution that will make the war with Japan look like a minor disagreement at a tea party. In America, Teddy Roosevelt is about to start his full term, wondering if he really should have made that promise about the third term. And in Switzerland, that patent clerk is about to publish a paper that will eventually lead to the atomic bomb, the GPS in your pocket, and the realization that now is a very relative term. The Waffle Cone is finished. The war is still raging, the subway is running, and the universe is about to become a lot more complicated than anyone in a starched collar ever dreamed. Goodbye, 1904. You were a ridiculous, wonderful, tragic mess. We'll see you in the history books, or at the very least, in the next time we order a cold drink and wonder why the cup is edible. The end. This has been Mark Twain.